Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video I'm back with another of my 20th anniversary retrospectives for Big Brother, this time talking about Big Brother 5. A season that I personally have a lot of nostalgia for, with this being the first season I actually have any memories of from when I was a kid, but it's also a season that I haven't rewatched in a while, probably since even before I had started this channel, and now having rewatched the season, I feel like my opinion of the season largely sticks. I really did enjoy Big Brother 5 on the rewatch, with this kind of being the last of the truly old school seasons that take place in the OG Big Brother house and have this old school music and this more mature tone to it that continues to dissipate as the show goes on, and also contains two of the most insane twists in Big Brother history that, while this season has typically gone forgotten in the grand scheme of Big Brother, I do feel like this is one of the more underappreciated seasons of the bunch. Though I do understand why it's forgotten, with this being sandwiched in between obviously more important seasons and the likes of BB's 2 and 3 and also BB 6. And really, outside of the formation of the back door, this is a largely irrelevant season to Big Brother history, but I still find it to be a fun one, with some really insane characters and it just being a consistently fun ride. And to talk about it all, I'll be running through my thoughts on the season from beginning to end. Let's start off with the premiere, which is a pretty jam-packed one. Obviously doing the typical introductions that you would expect, but also containing the first food competition, along with the first HOH competition, and also the reveal of the season's first big twist, with a bevy of content surrounding it as well. Now, to be fair, it was a 90-minute premiere, which allows them to do this, but again, there's just so much going on in this one singular episode. But obviously, we start all off with the players getting their keys, where we get the typical corny intro lines from Dolly saying that ditzy is her strategy, which, I mean, is it? And also Mike coming off as this really hardcore Republican, saying he's gonna call a freak and let it fly, and ends up putting a George Bush sign in front of his house before he leaves, and asks his son who's the president of the United States. And again, all this is just so ridiculous. We also have Drew saying that he's going from twin brother to big brother, while revealing that his twin is right next to him, which is like, what is the relevance of any of that? Which is also funny too, considering like Diane also has a twin, and obviously we know the later twin twist, so like all this is just kind of strange. And we also get again, a questionable line from Drew that he does repeat across the season, saying that he's not going to get involved with girls because women are the devil, which, I mean, probably not the best way to introduce yourself, but also a line that's pretty relevant to how his game plays out. Anyway, we then see the players entering the house, where we see them doing the typical running through the house looking for rooms, with one of the rooms in particular literally just having beds that are just slabs of concrete, which very much feel like the prototype for have-not rooms. But here we see Marvin taking the cot, saying that his strategy is to pick the worst bed to take one for the team, which doesn't gain him really any favors. And then he proceeds to hug Adria in this really creepy way, and he ends up being this really domineering personality, leading the introductions, and also comes off extremely forward in his flirting with Lori and asking Karen if she draws nude pictures. And again, all this is just, again, really creepy. And again, it does play into Marvin being a figure that just simply would not fly in the modern day. And initially, this house does very much give off this like frat house energy, where we see Mike mention that he has two sons and both of their mothers are babysitting them, to which Jason and Marvin get up to high-five him, which is again just such a bro-y thing to do. But anyway, we do also see Diane mentioning that she has a twin, leading to her and Drew bonding over that, which again might be relevant. And the inclusion of multiple twins on this season, while initially it can come off as a coincidence, I mean, in reality, it's very likely that this came from the recruiting process for the twin twists, where obviously finding twins to play the game together on Big Brother is a very difficult task to do, to where, again, I would suspect that Drew and Diane were found through that process of trying to find twins, as we know that both of them were recruited through their talent agencies, to where, again, it feels like that's the most likely situation to happen here, that they were cast with the thought of potentially using them for the twin twist, but also possibly cast here to be kind of red herrings for the reveal of the twin twist down the road as well. Also, we have Jennifer reveal that she wants to be called Nokomis, which means daughter of the moon, to which we then get content about how weird she is, with there being talk about how she'll be an easy target and that no one will feel bad, which, considering how dismissed Nokomis was at the beginning of this game, it is actually kind of impressive how she was able to end up playing a relatively strong game moving forward. But following this, we get the first food comp, which we still end up being in the era where The punishment is PB&J, which the show still tries to hype up as the worst thing ever, when again, it's not that bad. But anyway, this is a challenge where you have to navigate across a double helix that's spinning with balls on it, and have to grab balls along the way, to which the balls represent what food they get, which we just essentially montage through most of this competition, as again, it's not particularly interesting to watch, though we do see Holly be the only one to fail it, which seems pretty apt for this season, along with her getting a ridiculous confessional once they open the ball that has tuna on it, where she says that her cats like tuna, but they're not here. And we also have her just saying, did I lose, after you're clearly timed out, which again, it's just like, Holly is obviously this very ditzy person in this game, and it's funny considering most people thought it was all an act, where again, it's clearly not an act. Anyway, Lori ends up getting the ball that has lobster tail on it, which is where we get the reveal that there's a key inside that ball that opens a chest, also in the backyard, that inside of it is $10,000. So here we have her being given a dilemma to take the cash, which in doing so will make everyone eat PB&J for a week, essentially making this entire competition pointless. Or if she says no, it'll just go down the line, and every player will then get the opportunity to just say yes to it, which is like, why would you say no then? Like, obviously, yes, her saying yes to this does put a massive bullseye on her back, but why would you say no? Like, literally, it's just handing $10,000 to somebody else. And here we do see people telling her to take it, which, again, it did seem like a good chunk of people here kind of understood her dilemma, though Marvin was not one of those people, with him being clearly annoyed at this, and ends up constantly targeting Lori from this point forward, which I think really just shows you this kind of narrow point of view that Marvin has in the game. By the way, we do see Lori ending up bonding with Will, who gets a good chunk of focus here in the premiere, where we do get this segment here about the cast looking for the gay guy, because that matters, I guess. But we have Will revealing that he is waiting to tell the others that he's gay, and that he'll find the right time to play it, to which, I mean, he doesn't really end up waiting that long, but it really did feel like Will faced a lot of blatant homophobia across this season that, again, sadly was the norm in early 2000s, but again, we do later see the guys make comments about him, and obviously his later eviction week. It does make you feel for him there, but we do see him again build this relationship with Lori, and he also ends up bonding with Karen as well, to where they become a trio that essentially ends up being the core of one side of the house. Well, also here we do see the Four Horsemen form, where we see the guys broing down their shirts off in the middle of the kitchen, with it being Drew, Michael, Scott, and Jace, where they do a fist bump. Though what's funny is that during this scene, Diane is literally right there, and did seem to actually be aligned with them at a point where we do get DRs talking about Diane being with them, only for that to completely change by even the time of nominations. But it does seem like Diane, right from the beginning here, is playing both sides, which is something that she does really across this entire season. But it's at this point on the show where we do get the reveal that there is a twist that is so shocking that it will change the lives of some of the house guests forever. Also revealing the season's theme, that being Project Do Not Assume, Project DNA. DNA in particular obviously relating to the twist here, where we find out that two players here are related but have no idea, with it turning out that those two people are Michael and Jennifer, aka Cowboy and Nokomis. Again, kind of funny that both of them went by nicknames, but again, they are half siblings. We do get a segment showing their backstory that was very much shown as this like documentary, with showing Michael talking about having never met his father and all the things he knew about him, only for us to then cut to Nokomis talking about her dad and all those things lining up. We get this like really bizarre content of Nokomis talking about how she always wanted an older brother, only for Michael to then say he always wanted a younger sister. And again, all this is just super sappy, but also just very exploitative. And that's really my thoughts on this twist. Like, obviously it is a very notable storyline coming from this season, and it is, again, this insane thing to come together, but it just really feels like it's really taking advantage of, obviously, Cowboy's just really sad backstory and utilizing it to be this big shocking twist on the show, which again just feels kind of icky, though I'm sure it gave Michael a lot of closure and obviously allowed for him to finally meet his father, and it obviously does a lot good for Michael after the show, though I feel like it being utilized on the show just feels kind of wrong. And it was actually going to be originally even worse, where the original plan for this twist was for Michael's father himself to be on the show with Michael, with him having tried to recruit him for the show and get him to go on the show not knowing that he's going to be on there for his long lost son, which again is even more exploitative in that sense. I do think it's better to end up being Cowboy and Nokomis here, where I think their dynamic is a lot more interesting with them being such radically different people, and with them also ending up on completely different sides of the house and actively working against each other's best interests at points. Again, I do think it leads to a lot of intrigue game-wise, and it's something that thankfully didn't greatly impact the overall strategy of the game. So really outside of this first week, it doesn't really come up that often beyond this, where it allows it to be this kind of just insane twist that Big Brother threw in there without it being too overboard. But in this premiere episode, we do see Cowboy figuring out the twist here, hearing Nokomis say that her last name is Deadman, to which he then proceeds to ask her questions about her dad, to which I will say I would find it personally kind of awkward if someone just started randomly asking me a billion questions about my dad before he even gets to know me. And also there's also an awkward little moment here where she literally says herself that she always wanted a big brother, and then proceeds to say because she wants to beat up on him, to which Michael just says that's cool, which is again a funny reaction to all that. But anyway, we then proceed to the HOH competition, where we have the players pairing up, with one person being left out of all this, with Will volunteering to be that person. But the challenge itself ends up being the Treadmills of Terror, aka one person runs on a treadmill while the other one answers questions, to which obviously if they get it wrong, the treadmill goes faster, to which it obviously ends up being an endurance challenge of who lasts the longest. So we do see Adria being the first out here after Marvin gets his own question wrong about being a soap opera fan, which again might come up again later. Well, it's also funny that the mud is like so thick here to where the players don't even fall into it, except for Cowboy, which considering Cowboy's like doofiness across the season, again I feel like that feels pretty right as well. But anyway, Jace ends up doing the best at the questions here, to where Scott ends up being the last to go to full speed, while Karen does pretty well here as well, but Scott ends up winning the challenge, where now Will help decide who is the first HOH. Though unlike last season where Scott literally just got to decide who won the challenge, Will here instead has to ask a question about himself, to where he gets to pick who gets the question, where if they get it right, they become the HOH. If they get it wrong, obviously the other person is the HOH. Obviously not giving this person the sole power to decide the HOH, which, I mean, I didn't feel like it was that overly powerful last season, to where I don't know why they made that change. Though again, it's not something offensive in any way. But we do get a funny moment from Will asking Scott if he wants the question, as Scott obviously was the one that did the most work here, only for Scott to say no, and Jace ends up getting the question, where despite him wanting to throw it, he ends up getting it right and becomes the HOH. Where again, funny that Jace wanted to come into the game under the radar when he literally doesn't do this on either of his 2 seasons. And we do instantly get talk here about how Jace and Scott are going to win all the competitions, and how there's never been a duo this strong in the game. It's like, why? I mean, this seems really ridiculous considering how early on it is, especially considering the comps here are not overtly physical. Again, like, we are an old school Big Brother where competitions were very much equitable. Again, if it was a modern day Big Brother, then maybe. Considering the equitable comps, again, this just feels really ridiculous, like how much focus there is on how much Jason Scott will dominate all the competitions. But now let's get to the rest of week 1, where obviously we do get a lot of focus on the Cowboy Nokomis storyline, where Cowboy ends up telling Jason Scott that Nokomis is his sister, and proceeds to later tell Drew and Marvin. Though again, what's funny is that Drew is actually there during the initial reveal, but just wasn't looped into the conversation for some reason. And clearly they all look at this as a joke, where they even ask him, what does this have anything to do with anything? Which is clearly not the reaction that he wanted. Though we then have them proceeding to call in Nokomis to the room, where he tells her, and she ends up also thinking that he's just messing with him, until the players are then gathered together and they are told to go into the DR, where they are given letters from their dad. Being this really emotional moment on the show, obviously having Cowboy find out that he does have a family on the outside world, while Nokomis obviously finding out she has a long lost brother. And again, this is all really insane content, again, really exploitative. But thankfully, it's not here for much longer. But strangely, through all this, even after the letters are given out, we then have Marvin talk about how he still doesn't believe it, which again is just the most Marvin thing, to where he's just overly skeptical about literally everything in the house. But Marvin seems to think of this as like a game move, to where this would benefit Cowboy and Nokomis, when it's like, it wouldn't. It instead puts a bigger target on their back. Like, for Cowboy in particular, this causes distrust within the Four Horsemen now, with them talking about, why did he only reveal this after the HOH competition? Which, again, even that is really stupid, as again, it's really just risking his position in the game. But also, this obviously adds in the threat for down the road of Nokomis and Cowboy working together due to the fact that they're siblings. And again, this is just an all-around bad game move. So the fact that some people consider this to even be a game move is actually really dumb. But this does end up leading to a lot of speculation over family connections in the house, where, again, they do joke around about what if everyone is related. But through this, and also obviously both Drew and Diane having twins, it does lead to some potential talks about there being twins in the game. But obviously they never fully figure out the twist, particularly who is involved in the twist. But anyway, through this week we also get luxury comp, typical one in week 1 where they win the hot tub. This ends up being a pretty notable one to me, where they have to make this giant margarita, and we have Cowboy dressing up as a lime. But through this they also get a margarita party, to where Marvin once again ends up being a massive dick, and him eating all the quesadillas and everyone being annoyed at him. We also have him talking about how he's working on the women. Or again, he was just looked at as really creepy early on here. I mean, Holly and Lori even accused Marvin of sexual harassment in week 1, complaining to the producers, though they didn't do anything. Which again is also not a coincidence that those are his 2 nominees the following week. Which again, like, just Marvin in general, I think is a tough character to wrap my head around nowadays, where I do feel like he is a fun TV presence. And the fact that he does say a lot of things that are really funny, has fun one-liners. He does have an interesting role on this season, but again, some of the things he says just inherently haven't aged well. But even beyond that, when you look up stuff that happened on the feeds, it really just makes you realize that he's someone that just probably shouldn't have been on the show. Like, 100% nowadays, he would get expelled if he was on a modern season, especially after the Dan Spilo incident. I feel like Marvin, again, despite being fun TV, ends up just kind of being an icky character whenever I look back on him now. But through this, I mean, the Horsemen do talk about targeting Marvin this week, as he is the social pariah in the house. They do end up deciding to keep him around as a shield in the game for them. Everyone else will probably go for Marvin eventually. Also, Marvin's super gung-ho on going for Lori, which is something that would benefit them. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense why they don't go for Marvin here. Though this does lead up to their actual target, where to explain this on the show, we get this segment about Jace wanting the men to wear the women's panties for the luxury competition, or Mike refuses to do it, saying that he doesn't want his son to get bullied, I guess. To where this is shown as part of why Mike becomes a target here, where Jace talking about how he's not becoming part of the herd. We also have this like really awkward conversation between him and Mike, to where Jace just outright says that, I don't know if you hate me. We have Jace calling him a gamer, and just straight up, I mean, like, I know from the feeds that some people did also look at Mike as pretty creepy. Again, not in the Marvin way, but more so in the fact that he would just like sit down and stare at people, which people didn't like. But really, we do end up seeing Mike be a somewhat active player in the game at this point, though, having a really strong relationship with Diane, to where they talk about forming an alliance with Drew and Adria, ironically what later becomes the Twin Alliance, just taking him out of it. But Drew ends up instantly ratting this back out to Jace, which obviously makes him the target there, probably the bigger reason why Mike is actually targeted. And along the way, we also have Jace finding a note in the HOH room, which reveals that behind one of the photographs is a TV, which essentially is a spy screen, which allows them to see live feed footage, but obviously without the audio, which is obviously a norm in Modern Big Brother, though this is the first appearance of it. But strangely, the Horsemen decide to just keep this to themselves, not telling the women about it, to where the women literally don't find out until week 4, which is pretty insane. And really, obviously, the Horsemen just go on the massive power trip this week. Where's Scott just gloating about how much he loves this power, and that they're just going to go back and forth with HOHs, and it'll be 4 horsemen to the end, which does even last the pre-jury. But anyway, we do see Mike and Nokomis getting nominated, with the Nokomis nominee really come out of nowhere, not even explained on the show, though we do later see Scott tell her that she's the pawn. We again get Scott having a funny slip up here of saying, you know why we put you up. I mean, while Jace put you up. Where obviously just Scott is just such a cocky player across this season. But Jace does say that Mike was nominated because he was creating alliances that he was involved in, and ends up declaring him as the Don, which obviously becomes his main nickname moving forward. And again, Mike says that he's never seen 2 guys dominate the game in this way. But it does bring up an interesting observation that I think is pretty innovative for the time, of him realizing that his campaign shouldn't be him against Nokomis, but more so him against Scott and Jace. Again, him having this recognition that his campaign should be more so about people feeling the need to keep him around due to him being the one to take shots for them, which is again another pretty common strat in the modern day. Anyway, this is also where we see the veto twists being announced, where it's revealed that not everyone is playing in the veto and only 6 players will play, the HOH and the noms, and they will pick one person each of their choice, which is a change to the veto that is a step in the right direction. Obviously, having less players play in the veto, which will allow for more of a chance of the nominees winning the challenge and allow the veto to do what it's intended to do in lessening the power of the HOH, and also allow for more potential of the gameplay shaking up midweek. Obviously, the problem with it on this season is the notion of how the other players get picked for the veto competition, where it's obviously just too gameable. It's too easy to shut out a player by just not nominating them and have the noms pick players that will use the veto to allow for that target to be taken out without any chance of saving themselves, essentially ruining the point of the veto, with this notion obviously being the basis around the concept of the back door, a commonly used Big Brother strategy nowadays, and one initially created by Mike, which feels like a random person to create this all-important strategy, though he is the first person to bring up this loophole in the game, later telling it to Marvin, to where that's how the strat gets utilized later in the game. But also straight up, it's a strategy that isn't anything too special, where I do see people give a lot of credit to the likes of Marvin and Nokomis, who are later obviously the first to utilize this plan, or even give credit to Mike, saying that they're strategic masterminds, when I feel like, again, this is a very obvious strategy. Where again, the only reason that this is even possible is because they reduced the amount of players playing in the veto to 6, instead of just everybody. Meaning that, again, this is the first possible instance of someone even being able to create this concept, and it was right away. So again, the fact that it was instantly pegged makes it just pretty apparent how obvious of a strategy this is, to where I do feel like most casts would have figure this out on their own right away. Again, very much feeling reminiscent to the concept of the split vote in Survivor, where I have very similar thoughts of that as well. Now, while Mike is someone that is brought up as the person that created the concept of the back door, his initial idea was very unpolished, if you will, where his idea was mainly just the notion of putting up your target after the veto, with the assumption that they wouldn't be able to play in it. However, his plan is flawed in the fact that his plan does incorporate nominating 2 members of the opposing side, which leaves it open for the target to be picked for the veto, obviously giving them a chance to win it in that way. Which, again, I'll here have to give credit to Marvin, who gets some of the very little credit I'll give him for his game across this season here, where he is the one to piece together this loophole of nominating other people in on the plan here to guarantee that the target doesn't even get to play in the veto challenge. A plan that he obviously later tells to Nokomis that ends up putting the plan together. So through that, again, I think at the end of the day, I would give Marvin more of the credit than Mike, while Mike, again, is the initial person to bring up the mere concept of putting up your target after the veto. I do feel like a lot of the inner workings of it actually makes it an effective strategy was more so created by Marvin. But in the lead up to the veto, we do get a few fights between Mike and Scott and Jace, where you have Scott just kind of openly campaigning against Mike right in front of him, where Mike ends up calling them out for being an alliance, to which they for some reason deny it, and even Lori says that, oh, they're just friends, which is, again, this is stupid. Like, how do you not know they're alliance? Though I will say, I do think Mike also gets on a little bit of a high horse with him saying that he didn't create an alliance to go after people, it's just for safety. And again, yeah, he was targeting Scott and Jace, and we do have Jace just walking away from the fight at that point. But anyway, we also have Mike telling Holly that he's gonna pick her as he thinks that he can beat her, and he wants a weak player against them, which, again, showing the tact that Mike has in the game. But it's funny, he literally just tells her, all you have to do is lose, and she doesn't even commit to that. But you do get the veto pick, where, again, it goes as expected, though Nokomis ends up picking Drew here, her really playing into working alongside the guys, something she does pretty well across this week, and making the guys think that she's a number for them, where they think of her as in their corner for next week as well. The challenge itself here ends up being Flamingo Toss, a carnival game of tossing rings at flamingos to pick another player to challenge, and whoever gets the better score ends up staying in the game, though if you both get the same score, you both stay in the game, which is kind of lame. But obviously this is a veto that very much disfavors the Don here, with everyone targeting him, and while he's able to take out Drew, he is later taken out by Jace, to where we have Jace saying, "You are eliminated," in a way that's always stuck out to me there. But then we have Scott telling Nokomis to just throw the challenge to him, to which surprisingly she does here, which, again, I just praised her for playing up her working with the guys, though I feel like this was probably a bit too much, and I was just allowed allows for Scott to gloat even more so about how much power he has, especially when Jace then throws the veto to Scott as well, giving Scott the power of veto here. But it's at this point where we do get a lot of talk around how the game is splitting up by gender lines, with Diane shown to be leading the charge and getting the women together, essentially all of them but Holly, but also adding in Will to form an opposition against Scott and Jace. And again, it is impressive for Diane here to be taking initiative in the game, but I feel like the way she makes this move is pretty suboptimal, which to be fair is pretty much a lot of her game. But she does end up making it pretty clear to Will that he's on the bottom of the group, even though he wasn't really, as obviously he had his group with Lori and Karen. But again, for Diane to make that known to him is pretty bad. Again, essentially making it known what her power structure was. So we already do here also have talk about potentially having Drew work alongside them as well, really showing Drew being well positioned in the game early on here, despite being attached to the Horsemen. Though once again, immediately after Diane tells him about this alliance, Drew rats her out. Jace, with now Scott considering using Tavito to make a move against the women, though for some reason want to target Adria instead of Diane due to them looking at her as a stronger player. But obviously the plan doesn't go through. He doesn't end up using it, to which he calls Mike the ultimate threat, I guess. And at this point, Mike is pretty screwed, no real chance at staying. But we do get some fun segments across this week. We do get a lot of Dodo content from Holly, of her talking about how she lives with her mannequin and she got the police called on her for changing it in front of the window. To which we also have talk from Lori and Diane about how annoyed they are at her, despite the fact that Lori actually thinks that Diane's her best friend at this point in the game. We also see Holly making a meal for Jace, with them being in a showmance now, and her feeding him, saying, "Little bird, do you want your little food?" which is so cringy. Which we then get content from Marvin, once again, having a bizarre read in the game, saying that Holly is the strongest player here, where he thinks she's really an MIT graduate, which I can assure you she is definitely not. But again, it's very strange how the perception, especially from the guys, was that Holly was this strong player that was using Jace in the game, when no, it was just Holly. And again, I do feel like misogyny obviously plays a factor into that, of them thinking that, oh, this woman is going to break up our bromance. Also, Holly gets the negative side of the women's side of things as well, where none of the women want to work with her because, one, she's too close to the guys, but also she annoys them. To where it really feels like Holly just had no inroads on this season outside of just her relationship with Jace. And also we get a segment here with Nokomis where she ends up dyeing her hair, with her ending up changing her hairstyle every week, to where I do find the execution of this a bit strange, where again, nowadays there are rules where you can't change your hairstyle until Thursday for sake of consistency on the show. Though we see Nokomis change her hair here midweek, which again, don't know why they allowed it there. But also here we do get more content revolving around Will, with again, the Horsemen making some pretty homophobic comments about him, saying that they think they can work with him because he's not too gay for us to freak out. We also have Mike saying that Will being gay doesn't bother him because he's not his type, which again, obviously that's the only reason to not be bothered by it. So again, definitely some homophobic comments being made here. Though we do interestingly get this debate between Will and Mike on the ethics of gay marriage, to where obviously Mike is this staunch Republican. And while again, I obviously don't agree with Mike's point of view on this, I do like that they at least came off cordial during this debate. It's something you kind of rarely see in political debates, especially nowadays. But anyway, we also get to the eviction episode. That's the typical tropes of this era, with there being a family segment, with this one having us see Cowboy and Nokomis' families and them finding out about the twist, which obviously comes off as really melodramatic. We also get the typical interview with the HOH, with Jace kind of describing the pros of being the first HOH, with him explaining that it allows you to build trust and form alliances. Probably being the first to articulate this on the show, which is funny considering he doesn't end up reaping the benefits of really any of that. This is also where the audience gets the reveal of the twin twist, another surreal twist to be added to the game, having these two twins play the game as a singular person, switching in and out. And if no one realizes it by the halfway point in the game, they will be able to enter the game. A twist that is just fun. Again, it has almost no relevance to the actual game itself, and if anything, it really screws over the twins themselves, which we'll talk about later, but it really does lead up to one of my favorite moments in the show's history, when the twist ends up getting revealed to the others. Though again, it is funny to see people clocking the potential of this twist, but just thinking it might be with the likes of Drew or Diane, or even more so Holly. But here we do learn that it was actually Adria who's playing with her twin sister Natalie, who are switching in and out every few days, only able to learn about what's going on in the game through the information given during the switch, giving them very limited info, making this again a very difficult way to be playing the game, especially for Natalie, who has to also play with the burden of having to pretend like she's Adria and having to hide her own life, which again must be a very difficult task to undertake. But again, it is overall just a kind of a fun twist here, and kind of just insane that Big Brother did this so early on in its run. But obviously we get to the vote where Mike is voted out unanimously, to where he did seem a little ticked that he didn't get a single sympathy vote, which again, why? And his exit interview here is a bit interesting, to where he does claim that he didn't even really try to get votes in his favor, as he kind of felt homesick and was okay with going home, says his heart wasn't into it, which I do think that is a bit of a shame, considering it does feel like Mike had some really interesting strategic thoughts in the game, though obviously none of them really came to roost. But it's also funny that in the goodbye messages, we do see Scott once again being full of himself, where he says that you are right, that I am the strongest player in this game, and Mike proceeds to say that he is right, that I am right, saying that this is the strongest alliance that he has ever seen. And Mike complains that the other players weren't playing the game like he did, which again, didn't you just say that you didn't try to stay? But either way, again, let's talk about Mike, who I think is a fascinating figure in Big Brother history. Obviously one that was the social pariah from pretty early on, that tried to make some alliances and it got back to the HOH, become a massive target because of that. Also someone that didn't really gel with a lot of the house and didn't really try to build these social bonds in the house. We're outside the likes of Diane, Marvin, and kind of Drew. It didn't really feel like anyone really liked him that much. But I do feel like Mike is a big what if for me in terms of the strategic game, where obviously Mike was a big super fan of the show. And again, we do see him picking up on the strategic aspects of the show pretty well. Again, instantly clocking the back door. We have him, again, recognizing his ideal campaign strategy, and he was playing hard initially, building alliances. And again, I do feel like Mike has the potential on paper to play a really good game. I just don't feel like he'll ever be able to do it, just due to how bad he is socially in the game and how much he really doesn't care about playing the game socially. But outside that, he was obviously just kind of ostracized in the game and didn't really have much potential moving forward in the game. Well, with that, let's now move on to week 2, which starts off with the HOH comp Majority Rules, a comp that I've always personally liked, even though, again, it is very gameable. Obviously, this is before they end up doing so, where we end up getting a pretty interesting last batch of players here in Cowboy, Marvin, Holly, and Lori, with I think almost everyone there having completely different agendas, but Marvin ends up winning the HOH, to where we instantly see the Horsemen being excited as Marvin is part of their alliance, despite them talking about targeting him as well. And we do see a lot of talk within the men here about taking the boys to the end, which leads to a lot of weaponization of the previous 2 seasons, where obviously both BBs 3 and 4 ended up with a all-women final 2, to where we do get talk about how we can't allow 2 women to get to the end again, I guess. Obviously, initially here, Marvin ends up targeting Lori, with the Horsemen wanting him to use Karen or Diane as a pawn to take a vote away from her. Though, at the same time, we do have Karen and Will talking about wanting to get Holly on the block, which we do see very little of the work that was actually put into getting Holly on the block, which they end up doing pretty effectively on this week, though we do end up seeing very little of the work that was actually put into getting Holly on the block, and instead focus more so on the drama between Holly and the Horsemen, where we do see Scott getting a lot of content here, talking about how Holly is playing Jace and how that weakens the Horsemen, which part of it did seem to come from some jealousy from him, where he was also crushing on Holly. And we do get some friction between Holly and Jace over her getting upset after he brags about how many women he's hooked up with, to where Holly ends up confiding this in Diane, who tells her that Jace is just playing her, which she later takes back to Jace, leading to this big miscommunication, where Jace thought it was Lori that said this, and Jace ends up confronting Lori, only for her to be confused. And again, it ends up being this big blowout there, with Holly now being upset at him for doing this. And we get this funny moment of her giving him food, only for her to call him a jerk as she leaves. But again, all this drama and friction between the Horsemen did seem to play a factor into Holly getting on the block here. Till we get to nominations, where Marvin does end up doing nominations with a cigar in his mouth, which is funny, but he talks about nominating the 2 most influential players in the game, aka Holly and Lori, I guess. Again, the 2 people that called him out for sexual harassment the last week. But also, again, just misguided in thinking that they're most influential. Now, Lori Lori, again, I think you could debate it. I would say he's wrong. I would say more of Will or Karen are. But again, Holly is just completely misguided. And to really show how influential Holly is in the game, she then has a confessional talking about how she's going to stick it out because she made a promise to herself and her cats. Again, the most influential person in the game. But again, these are really just terrible noms for almost everyone involved in this decision making here. And putting Holly up obviously just puts Holly in danger, with Lori having the votes to stay against Holly, as we do later see with the women getting together to target Holly. Again, just playing into exactly what the other side of the house wants, which again, for me, is bad for Marvin, as it takes away someone to preoccupy the other horsemen with, while also potentially upsetting Jace in the process, where by this point, Marvin had actually changed his target to Holly, wanting to separate Holly and Jace, which again just feels like this really short-sighted move, a move that he is making just because he is upset that there's other duos in the game, which again, this very surface level view of the game is really just the entirety of Marvin's game. And again, I get this notion of him realizing that he's on the bottom of the guy's side of the house and he ends up trying to play the middle, but making this move here really just ends up with him annoying both sides of the house, both being annoyed at the decisions he made, and causes him to not gain any social capital from any of this. And it's also obviously bad from the horsemen as well, as they're obviously risking a number in their corner, and them failing to get Marvin to not put Holly on the block and instead putting up someone that would guarantee Lori going home is definitely a fault on their end as well. And we do spend a lot of this week seeing the schemes from the men's side of things, of them trying to get the votes on their side, them making deals with Adria and Nokomis to vote Lori out, which wasn't going to happen. We also see them sending in Cowboy to try to get Nokomis on board, where he's just really terrible here in trying to flip her over, and him not giving her any info on what's actually going on here, not telling her that Lori is even the target, just telling her to vote the way he wants her to vote. And again, all this is bad. And along with that, we also get this segment about the horseman giving Michael a makeover, to which it leads to Will talking about how the guys can work Michael any way they want and they're using him, and it's sad. And I think this really plays into Cowboy's overall perception in the game, where from a game front, he just simply was not respected. People did not look at him as a true game player, and more so looked at him as someone that was being used by the people around him, which I think definitely plays into his lowered jury prospects from the majority of people on this cast. This also leads to a food comp where Will ends up costing the house a lot of their food, which this leads up to a segment that, again, not a good look for the men of the house, showing them as being pretty homophobic here, with Jace continuously saying that things are gay, and he gets upset that people would call him a homo. We also see Michael asking Will if he cross-dresses because he assumes that that's the same thing with being gay, and again, not a good look for them there. Really just showing you the struggles that Will is going through. But this also leads up to Will getting some great strategic content, with him talking about them putting together a plan called Operation Security Blanket, of them pretending to the guys that Lori is going home, giving them false hope, only to then blindside them, which did seem like it was going to go through here. And we do see Diane doing her part of this strategy and pretending to Holly that she actually likes her now, only for us to get this bizarre moment of Scott just coming in and being an asshole to her, saying she has as much power as Saddam Hussein, which is again a very timely reference. He proceeds to call her trailer trash, and again, just a terrible dickish moment for Scott here. And we even see Holly and Jace both consoling Diane in this moment, with even Jace being upset at Scott for this. And this does lead up to Diane saying, "No one breaks me down," which is a moment that's utilized in her all-star package that I just remember for some reason. But really, this entire plan seems to be going through smoothly until Lori reveals to Karen that she actually wants to go home. Again, despite having the votes on her side here, where Karen and Will do eventually convince her to stay, though, and really it felt like they were actually going to keep her against her will anyway. It does lead to Lori talking about how if she wins the veto, she's not going to use it and just leave herself on the block, which actually ends up being a common trend on this season, where there are numerous times where people talk about winning the veto just to leave themselves on the block, which is just strange that was the culture of this season, where, again, this is after Marcellus had already gone home by not using the veto on himself. It feels weird that this is just a thing that happens almost every week on this season, though thankfully never actually ends up going through. Anyway, we do get to the veto pick, where ironically nominating Holly ends up leading to the men actually having the advantage in the veto challenge here, with it being Lori and Karen versus the other four. Though, to be fair, Marvin was not on board with the Horsemen's plan at this point. But obviously, Holly ends up picking Jace, To which the challenge ends up being a somewhat physical comp of untangling a rope through a course, something a firefighter like Jace would be good at, and what do you know, he wins veto here. And once again, Holly does talk about leaving noms the same, because now Lori wants to go home, and she thinks Lori would go home over her. And she says that if Jace uses the veto on her, people are just going to continue to think that she's the mastermind. Again, all of this just being really dumb, as it would have been Holly sealing her own fate, but we do get to the veto ceremony where Jace does use it on Holly anyway, where Karen is the renom, guaranteeing that Lori will go home here, even though we do have Will and Diane ending up voting to keep Lori, with Will actually talking about wanting to save Lori due to her being a bigger asset in the game, though it doesn't really feel like the numbers were ever truly there. But through this, we do have Marvin being really annoyed at Jace for using the veto, and Jace being annoyed at him back for nominating Holly to begin with, though where the Horsemen do now talk about targeting Marvin the following week, as they clearly can't trust him anymore, though this ends up getting back to Diane, who tells Marvin that Jace is coming after him, leading to a funny editing trick of the two in the DR literally saying the same thing about each other, about how they can't trust each other. Speaking of DRs, we also get a really notable one from Karen this week of her doing these impersonations of Jason Scott. That ends up being a fun character moment for her, where Karen ends up being someone that seems to be a fun presence. Ends up obviously being a pretty strong player, as we'll talk about, but I do feel like her edit did very much feel more subdued than you would expect, considering how wacky of a figure she seemed to be at most points. By the way, this is also where we do get to see the Drew and Diane showmance, with Diane constantly talking about him being sent from heaven and never having seen such a beautiful man. Obviously, this ends up being one of the major storylines of the season, despite the fact that I believe Drew had a girlfriend back at home, which makes this a little bit weird. And again, it's very much implied that Diane has always been more into Drew than Drew was into her. And considering obviously the results of all of this, it does make the entire relationship feel a bit awkward on the rewatch. But we eventually get to the vote where Lori is evicted 7-2, though Julie does her trick of saying, Karen, you are safe. Though we do get some panic from the other players in that moment, not realizing what she was doing there. But again, we do lose Lori, who I do think is a interesting player to talk about, in the sense that I always estimated Lori as a pretty bad player. I remembered her being someone that, while yeah, she had some allies, she didn't really have much else going on with her. Though I think on the rewatch, I do look at her as a better player than I remember. Now again, she did want to quit at the end, and definitely Karen and Will did seem like the strategic minds of their trio, but again, like, Lori had the votes to stay at the beginning of the week. If she had been up against Holly, which her own alliance had actively put together that plan to get Holly on the block, then she more than likely stays. Again, she had half the house on her side and seemed to be very good socially, where even after she leaves, there's still constant talk about wishing Lori was here. Now again, I do think she is very much lacking strategically. I don't think she really has much of a strategic bone really in her body, and either way, she was still a pretty big target for the opposing side. But I do feel like, in a way, I do look at Lori as someone that got kind of screwed over by comp results, to where she should have been pretty poised to make a deep run on this season, even though at the end of the day, the main thing that you obviously remember from her is the fact that she took the $10,000, and outside of that, she didn't really bring that much to the show. But with that, let's now move on to week 3, where the HOH here ends up being a Q&A, asking questions if things are higher or lower based on players or things in the house, to which we do get a pretty fun result here from Drew winning his first HOH here completely by accident on a question where the majority of the players were still in the game. He was the only one to get it right, with him completely guessing. And we do get this fun celebration from Jason Scott, who just run around like jackasses. But the Drew HOH here ends up being a really interesting one that kind of highlights Drew's position in the game at this point, which is a pretty strong one that also does make you realize his kind of faults strategically. This entire week starts off with a lot of Marvin, where we do see Marvin going up to Drew and telling him to float a rumor that he's gonna go up, as that way the women won't realize that there's a men versus women dynamic, which is stupid. I mean, this instantly ends up backfiring on him, where Drew's actually annoyed at Marvin for telling him what to do, and really just like, it's dumb just for Marvin to put his name out there to begin with, as his name is legitimately out there, and by now making it seem like he could potentially go on the block, it just leads to even more possibility that he actually will go on the block, which is what Drew and Cowboy actually wanted to do this week. But he actually did want to take out Marvin for most of this week, only for Jason Scott to shut that down, think that Marvin will again be a shield for them, and then looking at the women as more immediate threats. But yeah, I think terrible for Marvin. But with that, I guess we should talk about the Cowboy of it all, the where, again, there was this big rivalry between Marvin and Cowboy on this season, with them hating each other throughout it, with Marvin boiling that down to Cowboy being a racist, as we see him claim in the finale. And while there could definitely be biases factoring in to their dislike of each other, I do fully believe that that's not really the case, where, based on the research I've done at least, it does seem like a lot of this stems back to a conversation that we actually see during this week of the show, of Michael talking about his in-laws' family and how they own an oil company, leading to Marvin joking around how he's rich, when obviously Michael himself is not. He had to work multiple jobs, he came from a very poor background, so you can see how that would be insulting to him, along with the fact that Marvin then spreads this around the house that he's rich, which I do feel like that's the true cause of this rivalry, at least to the point where it lasts the entire season, where, again, it really feels like Cowboy is anti-Marvin from that point forward. But anyway, Jason Scott here do want Adria out, again, looking at her as the strongest person on the women's side of things, and talking about putting up Diane against her, which seems misguided here to want Drew to put up his own showmance, which, I mean, to be fair, he does do later in the season, but again, this early on, where he could have potentially put up so many other people, and she very much could have gone home. It seems very misguided for Jason Scott to be pushing him in order to do this, and it does work against them later in the week, whereas instantly ends up being used against them, where really this week essentially ends up being a bit of a redo of the previous week, where, again, Drew, despite being in the Horsemen, was still very much in the middle and had more relationships on the other side of the house than any of the other Horsemen. And through that, Drew does try to appease both sides like Marvin did by wanting to target Marvin this week, but does also plan on using Adria as a pawn to go alongside the guys, where Drew does tell Adria this, aka Natalie at the time, which he clearly doesn't want to do, as even they had a pretty strong bond from the very beginning of the season over their religious beliefs, and she obviously pushes back against this, leading to Drew questioning his noms once again, to where this is where we see the women attempt to throw Holly under the bus again, where Drew does talk about how Holly is getting in between Scott and Jace, and we do see them fight once again over Scott's jealousy of their relationship. And Diane in particular here ends up playing a pretty major role this week, using her relationship with Drew to her benefit and getting him to put Holly on the block, which is a terrible move from Drew. I mean, taking out a number on his own side while also burning trust with Jace. And again, it's literally just the exact same move as the previous week, but even worse considering Drew's even more solidly on the side that he's burning. And again, I get him trying to play the middle here, but I do feel like he ends up doing it pretty sloppily, and again, just harms the relationships around him through doing so. But again, we get to nominations where he does nominate Holly alongside Nokomis, blindsiding his own alliance in the process, not even telling them beforehand, with Jason Scott obviously being pissed off by this, though initially we do see Jace going up to Drew and telling him that he understands, and says that he'll be willing to cut Holly this week for the sake of the alliance, though a few minutes later he thinks about it again and then gets pissed off and rants to Scott about him, calling Drew an idiot, with them essentially realizing that he hung them out to dry here. He's leaving Jason Scott open to be targeted the following week, with him not weakening the side that is coming for them. But they do end up confronting Drew, where Drew is surprised by their reaction now, and Drew does get really emotional here, talking about how he didn't want to make a decision that he would regret, saying that this is the lowest low that he's felt in his entire life, which, to be fair, does very much show off his youth, where, I mean, straight up, Drew is one of the youngest players on this season, and I do think it's moments like this that it does very much show his lack of life experience. But it is funny that he literally says that this is his biggest nightmare, that they would think that he's thinking about himself, which, I mean, you were. I mean, yeah, a lot of this is under the guise of him wanting to protect the Horsemen by taking out the person that could break them up. But in reality, he's also doing this to play the middle. So again, this was a self-interested move. But through this, he does end up agreeing that they should try to get Holly off the block. To which, at this point, Cowboy does his own thing. Literally, again, the same thing as last week, and trying to work with Nokomis. This time trying to get her to pick him for the veto competition under the guise of backdooring Marvin. When the reality is that they would backdoor one of her own alliance. What do you know? Cowboy fails at it. Of course, she ends up picking Adria instead. Though again, like the previous veto comp, the majority of the Horsemen do end up playing in this competition, giving them pretty good odds to get what they want. And we do, for some reason, have this assumption that the veto here is going to be somewhat food related, to where Jace has this funny moment of him making himself puke right before the challenge, only for it to be a casino-themed challenge, it being Bluff Me a Veto. A pretty unique challenge here in the fact that the players are given questions about themselves and are told to either bluff or tell the truth, to where the other players will bet on what they think the dealer did, and then the dealer will get the chips of people that got it wrong. Again, an interesting idea and a really equitable comp here, which again, something like this would be nice to see in the modern day, but Comus ends up taking the lead through lying about having stalked a guy for a year, and pretty much everyone believing that, to where she ends up winning the veto, ruining the Horseman's plans here, which I should mention, she does later regret using the veto when she sees who the renom is, which again, is the season for you. But at this point, Scott does create a plan to nominate Adria and pull Marvin back onto their side, to which they would still be able to get to a tie in the vote and still be able to save Holly. A plan that is good on paper, if only you didn't ruin your relationship with Marvin. And Marvin also didn't really want Holly out, and also while being somewhat close to Adria at this point. And also, if Cowboy and Drew were also not that close to Adria, where they obviously want her to stay over Holly. So again, not a great plan, not one that seemed to be an effective one once people actually thought it through. But again, I think one that could have possibly worked had they just picked a different target. If they had gone for someone like a Karen, who at this point was a bit more expendable, especially for the people on the Horseman side of things. I do feel like it may have gone through, but Marvin obviously initially says that he's down, to where this is where we see the formation of the Santa Monica Van Boys, a fake alliance obviously to pacify Marvin, to where the name of this alliance is never explained on the show, though it does stem from preseason, to where the Horsemen plus Marvin were all in the same casting finals, to where they ended up being in the same van in Santa Monica. So I mean, you probably get the point. But the show portrays it as if the Horsemen are tricking Marvin in this instance, when it's very clear that Marvin knew what they were doing. Where again, the fact that they don't formalize an alliance until this point where they need his number makes it pretty obvious what they're doing here. But either way, we get to the veto ceremony where Holly has this funny moment of just awkwardly laughing after her veto speech, where just no one is amused. But Adria ends up being the renom here, meaning that the twins are on the block and in danger of going home here, which is where we do learn a bit of a rule about the twin twist that I actually didn't remember. The fact that if a twin gets voted out here, only one of them actually will go home and the other one will stay in the game, essentially giving the twins, which obviously makes sense from a production standpoint, is they can't afford to lose two people when they had planned to have that extra person. But it is an interesting wrinkle to think about here, and it essentially giving one of the twins an extra life had one of them been booted early on. Anyway, this is also where we do get a segment about Adria being really religious, getting our first taste of Adria and Natalie's gameplay style of using the Bible as part of their strategy, using it to demonize those that they're against, but also bond with those that are also religious, which, while it can be an effective strategy in building these relationships with the likes of Drew and Cowboy, it also does end up really turning away the likes of Marvin and Diane that are kind of disgusted by this gameplay approach. Though Adria does end up doing a pretty good campaign this week, particularly in getting Drew and Cowboy to back down and wanting to get her out, to the point where Scott also ends up backing down as well, getting the vote back onto Holly, though he does end up making a deal with Adria over to Horseman's safety the following week, which he was never going to go through with. But again, funny how this deal ends up being claimed as Scott having saved Adria in the game, which is what they used against Adria the following week, when, again, I feel like it was more so Drew that saved her, with him being the true decision maker over all this. Where, I mean, straight up for Drew, I do think this is actually probably the better move. I mean, at this point, he already burned Holly and burned Jace in the process. You might as well just go through with the Holly move at this point. Mind you, again, like him nominating Adria is also bad as well, where obviously he burns Adria, but Adria is still someone that is more willing to work with Drew in the long term, and someone that has a much more reliable number for him, and Holly, who is obviously more attached to Jace. So I do think by this point it is probably the correct call, even though, again, you shouldn't have put up Adria to begin with if you were going to do this. But obviously through all this, the vote does flip back onto Holly, to where Jace does try to fight back against it, though this ends up causing the Horseman to be even more resolute in it, as he ends up defending her too much, and they also catch them kissing when Jace ends up lying about it. So the Holly vote ends up sticking here. So again, Jace is right on paper. I mean, Adria is obviously lying to them, and Holly is a number for them, but obviously just really ineffective in getting his own alliance to do what he wants, where again, it is for the betterment of the alliance as as a whole, though when you look at the individual members of it, it's probably only really better for him and Scott. But again, this does cause a lot of fractions within the Horsemen, where we do have Drew calling Jace out for looking at him as if he stuck a dagger in his heart, with Jace thinking that Diane has gotten to him. Again, now it's actually being the same Holly situation, but now Drew and Diane. But again, it just made it very clear the Horsemen were on their way down. But we also get another confrontation through this week of Holly confronting Diane after the veto competition, of her celebrating with Nokomis, where we do get a funny little moment where Jace really egging her on to start the fight. To which during this fight, we do have Diane mentioning that there are sides, and Jace ends up really using this against her and trying to throw her under the bus to her own allies by saying that she leaked your alliance, which is like, again, pretty obvious alliance. But again, this leads to this pretty iconic fight for me, and them fighting in the kitchen over whether or not she threw her own alliance under the bus, which she ends up saying that you're not dumb and neither are we. So we then have Scott saying that you better win HOH next week, and Jace saying because you're gone, which obviously humorously backfires on them the following week. Where, again, through this, we also get this segment about Scott just making up random lies to the others for some reason, even claiming that he's an NFL player and that he's rich. Also, we have Jace's bizarre segment over his love of Brad Pitt, to where we do see Marvin humorously say that he looks more like Armpit. Again, Jace also ends up lying for no reason on the season, lying about his age, to the point where even people outside the show were confused over how old Jace is, considering all of his stories about his childhood did not line up with his presumed age. But anyway, we obviously just get to the eviction, where Holly gives Jace her lucky cat before getting evicted, only for her to go out in a 7-1 vote, with Jace obviously being the only vote to save her, to where he clearly does blame Scott for Holly leaving here, with him constantly talking about their personal issues, lost them an ally, him really holding a grudge against him moving forward. But the Holly interview here ends up being pretty funny one, where we have like Diane's goodbye message where she just says thank God and good riddance. We have her complete confusion over seeing Natalie and Adria, which I should mention the evicted players were shown goodbye messages from the twins themselves, and again that leads to a fun reaction there. But again, we do lose Holly here, who obviously is a fun character. I mean, she is obviously just really ditzy, to where the ridiculous things she was saying in the DR were just really funny. She had funny reactions to things. She got into drama. People didn't like her. Again, like, she brought a lot to the show. I will say gameplay wise, she's much worse than I remembered, where I think after rewatching this season, I think Holly's an all-time bad player, where really the only person she had in her corner the entire season was Jace, where everyone else was willing to cut her. Again, she almost goes home week 2 had Jace not won the veto. She does go home week 3 despite her own alliance having the HOH. Again, neither side really wanted to work with her, and she even talked about not using the veto to save herself in week 2 when she really needed to. And again, like, I just feel like Holly is possibly an all-time bad player here, where I feel like there's pretty much nothing that Holly does well on this season outside of, I guess, getting a relationship with Jace, but even then, that's barely anything. Considering Jace also plays the season terribly. It's like, I definitely forgot about just how bad Holly was, to where, despite, again, being great TV, she's probably one of the worst players we've ever seen. But anyway, with that, we get to week 4, which gives us a pretty iconic HOH comp, one that obviously is not as iconic as its successor, though we essentially get the prototype for the pressure cooker here, where everyone has to stand and hold onto a button on a cardboard cutout of themselves, with this ending up being the longest endurance comp up to this point in Big Brother history, lasting 9.5 hours, with no one even dropping out until around the 2-hour mark, to where they have to add in rules, and even then, it lasts a really long time. Now, we do see most people dropping out before the 5-hour mark, to where we do have like Scott getting eliminated due to touching with his other hand, where Diane ends up calling him out for it, to which Scott calls it asinine of her to do that, which, again, I guess, I mean, they would have caught it anyway, but okay. And also, it's like, why would you think that she would want you to win HOH? But along the way, we do get more of the tension between Scott and Jace, with him clearly voicing his annoyance at Scott, and them getting into a bit of a tiff over Scott not saving him any pizza, which they had gotten as a temptation, though Jace and Diane do end up talking about making a deal around the 5-hour mark, which doesn't go through, though this does lead to them lasting over 4 more hours, with Jace trying to psych her out along the way, saying weird things like he's gonna beat up Cowboy, and starts making chicken noises and fake punches his standout, which are all really funny character moments. But the comp does end with Jace accidentally lifting his feet, leading to Diane winning the HOH, to which which at this point, Natalie and Adria are pretty much guaranteed to make it to the game, with Diane being their closest ally at this point in the game. But we do get a pretty funny HOH room reveal here, where we do see Marvin talking about how she has the ugliest dogs he's ever seen. We also have Scott saying that he's just going so she doesn't know how much he hates her, because I'm sure she doesn't know. And proceeds to go in there and just continuously talk about how much hotter her sister is than her, which was funny. We also get this followed up by the women finally figuring out about the spy screen, which again, the fact that the men kept it secret for that long was just really ridiculous. As for strategy of the week, we do see Diane wanting to target Jace, unsurprisingly, though what is surprising is that she initially doesn't want to nominate Scott, talking about not looking at him as a threat and instead talk about using Cowboy as a pawn, and also talking about how Marvin is the backup target. Now, this obviously ends up changing as they do end up putting up Scott next to Jace due to the risk of him potentially winning the veto and using it on Jace, and really just in general the closeness between the two, to where he does end up becoming the target by the end of the week, where he does end up becoming the backup target as we get deeper into the week, though it is interesting that coming into this week, he was actually somewhat safe. To where while he is a bad player, it does feel like this week in particular, the week that he was actually booted, is a week where he's mostly just brought down by his connection to Jace and this need to split up Jace and Scott, more so than what Scott actually did actively wrong. But again, we get nominations where Jace and Scott are nominated, to where we again get a funny Karen confessional of her saying that she's happy that they're squirming and they can kiss that as she smacks her ass to the camera. But also here we get a segment about how funny Marvin is, leading to him making some jokes that have not aged well. We see him doing a stereotypical Asian accent. We see him talking about crazy hoes. We see him playing with Diane's hair and talking about selling it. It's like, it's funny as Marvin even says that, oh, it's not strategy, it's just who I am, which is like, is that a good thing? Anyway, we do see Scott and Drew both campaign against Marvin here to Diane in an attempt to obviously make Marvin the backup target, to where we once again see Scott talking about how if he wins the veto, he's going to actually use it on Jace, hoping that Marvin goes up to where he thinks he'll be safe, which would have been hilarious if that's what actually happened this week. Anyway, we see the players getting piggy banks that they're made to decorate, to which Karen is exciting, calling it Karen porn, which I feel like is a phrase that has a very different connotation nowadays, but it's obviously to be used in the veto comp, where, again, with the veto pick here, we once again get all the horsemen competing, only to face off against Diane and Will, and this is a veto that I've always personally loved, that only ends up being used twice in the show's history, but I think it leads to some pretty great results, where each player is given a certain amount of coins to divvy out to the other players, to where the person who gets the closest to 20 without going over wins, where both times it's played, the social pariah ends up winning it, despite the fact that they could have been easily taken out if the opposition had just loaded coins on their target. Yet here we do see Diane messing that up by splitting her coins, leading to Jace winning the veto instead. To where we get this really great reaction from Jace, with him continuing to smash his pig even more, and then standing on top of the podium and making weird noises, and proceeds to do a victory lap around the house, saying, "Born again, baby, I ain't leaving, this is my house." Proceeds to say in the DR that the only way I don't use the veto on myself is if I fall down doing a victory lap and crack my head on concrete and go insane. And again, it is moments like this I do find Jace to be a really fun character on the show. Oh yeah, he definitely can come off as a dick at points, and again, does definitely say comments that I do not agree with. He still is a pretty humorous figure on the show. But again, at this point, with Jace winning the veto, we do see the target shifting onto Scott. I'm talking about needing to split up Jace and Scott, and that Marvin can be saved for down the road, though for some reason they still end up nominating Marvin instead of just putting up Cowboy, which I get in terms of them thinking that they have the numbers anyway, and having the Horseman campaign against Marvin will sever ties even more and does allow them to blindside Scott, with the Horseman thinking that they're actually going through with their plan by putting Marvin up. But again, I do feel like a lot of this is just playing it up a bit too cute. But again, Scott is the correct target here. Probably should have been the target from the offset, where he really is the one that is keeping the Horsemen together at this point, where he is the one with the closest one-on-one bonds with each individual member. To where once Scott goes, Drew obviously instantly detaches himself from the group, with him never being particularly close to Jace. Also had this really great bond with Cowboy, and obviously had now the strained relationship with Jace, but it was still a connective tissue there that, again, it makes a lot of sense to take out Scott in this instance. Though we do get a humorous veto ceremony where Jace and Scott dress up as the characters from Dumb and Dumber and really just make a mockery of the entire thing. And Jace says that, to those that have conspired against me, kiss my ass. But anyway, Marvin goes up, and at this point, the Horsemen need just one more vote in order to save Scott. And they're doing a lot of work on Adria, obviously guilt-tripping her for what happened the previous week, which, again, guilt-tripping never works. It's not really optimal strategy, and really just makes Adria even more annoyed at them for trying to do it. And really, this is just such a glorious way to see Scott getting taken out of the game here. For us to see the Holly move just instantly backfire on him, where, again, they had the opportunity to take out Adria. Now taking out Holly over her directly leads to Adria being the swing vote here in a position where she ends up voting out Scott. Again, it's just so perfect. And it's really funny how indignant the Horsemen are over this when, again, they openly talk about how they're going to target Adria the next week anyway. So again, the fact that they're upset that she wouldn't listen to him is really stupid. But again, it's a 4-3 vote where Scott is just completely blindsided here, with him having a really awkward interview with Julie where you could just tell how shell-shocked he is. Or again, he comes out thinking that Jace actually was the one to betray him, but again, we do get a great reaction to the vote from Jace, with him just sitting in his chair in shock at first, and then seeing the yell, "It's on," as Scott leaves. Only for him to then go to the bedroom, take off his shirt, and start doing weights, and says, "Ultimate betrayal, ultimate," while he's just standing there by himself, and it gets so awkward. But we also have Jace confronting Adria, saying that she's the biggest liar in this game, and that Scott saved her, only for Marvin to join the fight, saying, "You ain't happy for me," to where Jace then proceeds to lie to Marvin, saying that he voted for him to stay, which is really stupid. Where again, he tries to convince him that Karen was the vote for Marvin, and Marvin says, "Don't pee on my leg," saying it's raining. Again, clearly Jace's game is completely blown up at this point, where again, he's essentially fighting with the majority of the house on the couches here, being accused of bullying people to vote his way, to where Marvin, of all people, is saying, "You don't talk to women like that." Again, coming from Marvin. But this is what leads up to one of the greatest scenes in Big Brother history in my mind, which is the twin twist reveal, where just everything about this scene is just so perfect. We start all off with Julie asking Diane how many players have been playing this game, and Julie reveals that she's incorrect, and now reveals that one of you has been playing with an identical twin, to where we instantly see people saying, "I knew it. It's Holly." And as Julie is explaining the rules, we just have the other players freaking out, clearly not listening to her, with speculation going rampant, where Jace starts to say it's Scott, despite the fact that Julie is literally saying to them that this person is still in the game. But obviously this is where Natalie comes into the room, and Julie awkwardly says, "Meet Natalie, but then again, you've already met her," to where again, no one's listening to her. But again, Jace ends up falling back into his chair, realizing he's even more screwed now, with the person he just called out now being double and the opposition gaining another number while he had lost most of his numbers, to the point where, while I understand Jace did try to quit the game later that night, deeming the twist as unfair, which with that we should talk about the players' reactions to the twin twist, to where while it does seem like on paper this twist doesn't really have that many game ramifications, and again it ends up going well enough for them throughout this first week after they joined the game, I do feel like the twin twist did a lot of harm to the twins' games at this point. Or again, not supporting the twins as people or even their gameplay following this, as they do play it terribly. I do feel like the reaction to the twin twist here from the players inside the house was very much similar to that of the Outcast twist on Survivor, with the players inside feeling like it was unfair. Unfair that the players had to be inside the house the entire time, while the twins were allowed to spend times to themselves. Obviously not having to deal with the pressures of the game at that point, them getting to spend nights in a hotel room. And through that, again, I don't think they could have won a jury vote even if they had gotten to the end, even before the disastrous HOH they later have. But again, it also made people just not want to even take them to the end, due to it being looked at as they had an advantage in the game of them both getting to leave the house at multiple points, but also now having a loved one in the game, and a loved one that will always work with you and someone that you can 100% trust. And beyond that, again, this twist also ends up really discrediting the twins as well. It makes people not trust them as much moving forward, as obviously they've been lying to them for the entire game up to this point. And it very much makes them feel like new people being added to the game midway through, which kind of reset their social capital in the game, with Natalie just outright having to introduce herself to to everyone else. And again, I do really feel like the twin twist, especially with how it played out on this season, does very much screw over the twins, even though, again, they didn't play well following this anyway. Before moving on, I guess we should talk about Scott, who was obviously a major presence early on in this season. I mean, he was a major character. He, alongside Jace, really dominated a lot of the screen time early on in this season and were these really big domineering personalities on the show, which I think is mostly a mixed bag. I mean, while I do think he was very entertaining on the show, he was also a complete asshole on the show. And again, seeing his treatment of the other players, particularly Diane, was particularly rough to see. Despite that, I will say, I do think Scott is probably a better player than I remembered on the rewatch here. And while he is very bad at a lot of aspects of the game, I do feel like he at least seemed to be the main pillar of the Four Horsemen. It felt like he was the person holding them together and the person that also did a lot of the strategic work for that group. To where, again, Drew is always kind of doing his own thing, while Cowboy didn't really do much strategy at all, and whenever he did, he was just constantly shut down. It did very much feel like Scott was the idea person for the Alliance, the person that came up with strategies and got them to execute them. Now, again, did he execute them perfectly, and were they even good strategies to begin with? That's questionable, but I do feel like he is a much more active player than I probably remembered him being, where I do think he does a lot of active strategic work in the game, even though it's not fully effective all the time. And again, obviously his cockiness is really what costs him the game. Him constantly thinking that his plans are working, and we obviously see those plans completely backfire on him by the time he goes home here. But now for week 5, obviously a really iconic week of the show, to where this obviously ends up being the week where we see the first ever backdoor executed pretty flawlessly. And while it is a pretty straightforward week gameplay-wise of Jace just being screwed from the beginning, it is still a pretty fun week to watch, especially seeing this plan come together, and it just ends up being a perfect way to conclude the pre-jury here. But it all starts off with an HOH comp, which is a true or false competition about things around the house, to where right away, Marvin, Cowboy, Drew, and Jace are first out of the competition, literally being everyone outside of the Women's Alliance. Again, a perfect result for them, to where Nokomis wins the HOH, with Julie awkwardly revealing this to her by saying, "You are the most observant house guest, and now you're the most powerful as well," which again was just a weird way to tell her she's won. But with that, obviously Jace knows he's screwed, with him only having Cowboy still in his corner, with even Drew distancing himself at this point. So we get this funny moment of Jace wearing a sign saying he's starting an alliance, and goes on the comedic campaign around the house, openly saying, "Me and you to the end, Diane," and says he's looking for a couple twins for his alliance, and that he's only going to take 7 or 8 people. Again, just a funny little moment of him mocking his current game position. But you get a nice little sentimental moment in the HOH room, where once we get there, we see Cowboy being able to see a picture of his dad for the first time, to which Nokomis ends up giving him the photo, which again is a nice little moment. But this is where we finally get to the strategy of the week, where here we get the reveal of Nokomis' 6-finger plan, which we strangely never hear Nokomis herself talk about it, despite her claiming to be a mastermind, where Will and Karen are the ones to explain the strategy on the show. And obviously this is the foundation of what we currently call the backdoor, a plan to intentionally not nominate your target initially, with the intention of not letting them play in the veto and take them out with no chance of saving themselves. Though again, that is largely because of the current veto rules that the nominees have to pick the other people that play in the veto, which obviously will allow them to pick other alliance members there, to where everyone will use the veto if they win it, to where obviously it guarantees that target goes home. Again, a strategy that is very effective in the game. We see it being executed many times following this, and again, it goes off without a hitch on this season. Now, I think there is a debate over who gets the credit for this plan, where obviously the show gives a lot of credit to Nokomis, and really it feels like a lot of BB history kind of remembers it as it being Nokomis that put this plan together. And to be fair, she is the one to execute it. She is the HOH to make this plan go through. She is the one to solidify all of the little pieces of the plan. Though again, the initial concept was brought to her attention by Marvin. Marvin did tell her about this plan and also volunteered to go on the block, which was a pretty questionable move, as he was clearly being set up as a backup target if something went wrong. Though, to be fair, again, he was probably going to go up anyway. So again, you can give credit to Nokomis, you can give credit to Marvin for bringing it up to her. You can also give credit to Mike, who initially created the concept that was why Marvin knew this was a thing to even talk about to begin with. So again, I think you can give credit to multiple people. Really, I don't really care who really gets the credit. as I think it's just such a basic concept that anyone would have figured this out anyway. Now, qualm of this plan and why it wasn't used up to this point in the season is, again, in its current state, it still necessitates that one of your own alliance members remain on the block by the end of the week, to where you still need to have the numbers to secure that person's spot in the game, which with this house being a very split house for the last few weeks, again, it would have been a very precarious position to even go through this plan, as again, there would have been a serious chance of your own alliance member accidentally going home. Though obviously now, with almost the entire house being united against Jace, it very much allows for this plan to go off without a hitch. But again, the nominations here end up being Marvin alongside Diane, with this being an interesting spot for Diane as well, who goes up instead of Drew, who they probably didn't trust enough yet to go through this plan, but as again, for all they know, Drew could have just gone back and just picked Jace for the veto. But also by having Diane on the block, it would make it more likely that Drew ends up using the veto anyway, as he could potentially use it to save her. So again, these end up being pretty effective noms there. They're really putting Marvin in a corner as well of having him have to go through with the plan, or else he's screwed because he'll just be voted out as they have the numbers against him. Though again, from what I understand, Marvin was fully on board with this plan. He 100% wanted Jace out at this point. Even though again, I feel like his optimal play would have been to keep Jace around as a shield for him, though again, never seemed like it was really happening, especially after the HOH result. And again, through that, I cannot having Jace on the block to begin with is securing his spot in the game, as if he had been on the block against Jace, which probably would have been the initial idea, and if Jace had won the veto, he would have been screwed anyway, while this makes it more likely that Jace doesn't go on the block until after the veto. So again, I do think for Marvin, it does make sense by the end of it, even though again, in an ideal world, he would have been able to keep Jace in the game, but again, that was just never really happening this week. But again, we get to nominations where everyone ends up putting on a performance here for Jace, where really everybody but Cowboy is in on this plan, which again straight up feels a bit unnecessary, as Jace was screwed either way, but it did make for fun TV with Nakoma's pretending like her noms are genuine, with us getting this fun moment of Jace trying to be the wise ass he is and trying to call out who the first key coming out of the box is going to be, only for it to actually be him. And we see him fully buying into this, actually thinking his campaigning with Nokomis actually worked, leading to Jace celebrating afterwards, bragging about how he got his key first, ladies and gentlemen, and talk about him not even wanting to play in the veto now, as he needs to lay low, which, again, good thing because he's not playing the veto anyway. This leads up to a conversation later that night to where Marvin talks to Jace and Cowboy about how Diane is just a pawn, making Jace realize that he can still go up, with Cowboy saying that if you win, you're safe, only for Jace to respond with his realization that he's not even playing. To where we have him in the DR now saying that he's pieced it all together, that she didn't put me on the block because she knew that I'd be capable of taking myself with the golden veto, which I've always loved the way he said that. But again, he realizes that, yeah, Nakoma's putting Diane on the block makes no sense because they're best friends, which again, how did he not get that right away? Well, he realizes he's screwed. He says that tomorrow they're going to say, gotcha, only for Michael to then say, you got bitch slapped, which I found funny. Especially when thinking about a world where getting backdoored was called getting bitch slapped. But either way, Jace ends up campaigning to Marvin, obviously, to get him to pick him. But obviously Marvin doesn't do it because that would be idiotic from Marvin's point of view. So we get the veto pick where Diane picks Drew, with Drew actually being predetermined to win this veto to take out Jace, meaning that Drew would have to openly betray Drew here under the guise of saving Diane, which obviously is this thing to just make it sting even a bit more for Jace, but it also seems misguided to even put Drew in this position from the majority point of view, where why even bother putting your trust in Drew here, as him winning is pretty much the only possible chance of Jace not going home. Again, we've already seen Drew struggle with decisions like this, and considering the fact that he had always wanted to take out Marvin for literal rounds now, and him still having some allegiance to Jace, it really feels a bit misguided for me for him to put all their faith into Drew not using the veto, into Drew using the veto. Now, at the end of the day, again, losing Marvin isn't the worst thing in the world either, but there just seemed like an unnecessary risk there. But the veto ends up being one where players throw darts to balloons over people's faces, and the last person with a balloon wins, essentially a modification of the coconut chop challenge that, again, just instantly favors the majority, to where Jace would have been pretty screwed even if he was playing in this veto. But again, everyone easily just throws it to Drew, and Drew does lie to Jace and Cowboy about not using it, though it does seem like he actually at least considered it for a bit, where we do see a conversation between him and Diane, where she obviously talks him out of it, where really it would have been him crossing too many bridges at this point, pretty unnecessarily, as working with Diane moving forward was a lot more viable than working with Jace anyway. So again, Drew uses the veto on Diane, Jace is backdoored, with Nokomis still planning like this wasn't planned all along for some reason. Again, we get a frosty reception here from Jace, with Jace ignoring Drew's handshake and him getting into another fight with Diane, where the argument pretty much turns into Diane saying that he's jealous over their relationship, how he doesn't have that with Holly, which, again, not a great look for Diane postseason. But again, Diane ends up ranting about how no one stuck up for her, and we see her sobbing in Drew's arms, and Jace walks in saying that he wants to talk, only for her to say that she doesn't want an apology, only for Jace to say I wasn't going to anyway, and says kiss my ass, which again is a funny little moment there. But again, like, Jace is pretty screwed at this point, but there is still some interesting strategy going on at the end of this week, particularly from the formation of the Twins Alliance, obviously including the twins, but also Drew and Diane, considering they have twins. Again, you get it, an alliance made of people that have twins. Anyway, this also gives Drew a new landing spot in the game and a viable path moving forward, with again Drew having a really close bond with the twins over their bonding over religion, and him obviously having the showmance with Diane, while also still having his connection to Cowboy on the side, to where despite him openly betraying his old alliance, he actually does end up putting himself in a somewhat decent position coming out of this week, despite the fact that the likes of Karen and Will do start to pick up on how big of a threat he is in the game. But again, there were always just targets ahead of him, particularly Marvin at this point in the game. From mixing down the fact that his closeness with Diane did lead to some being worried about putting him up under the worry of upsetting Diane, it does end up leading to his position actually kind of bolstering through this week, and also ends up setting up an interesting dynamic for after Jace goes, with the majority now being clearly split between the Twin Alliance side and also the Will, Karen, Nokomis side of things. That leads to a lot of talk about potentially taking the shot the following week, again, despite having the likes of Marvin and Cowboy still in the middle. Now, I'll be honest, we get a couple notable segments on the show, from like Nokomis quitting smoking to Will roasting everyone's fashion sense in the DR. We get a checkup on the exes from BB4, but also we get a couple notable segments from Karen, who, again, gets just such a strange edit here, where we do see a lot of people talking about how they think she's going crazy, and her constantly talking about her husband, and people being upset and annoyed at her constantly talking about Larry, along with these just general frustrations over how she's just riding coattails. Where straight up Karen is commonly cited as one of Big Brother's most underrated players, and while I do agree for the most part, I do feel like it's moments like this that do make me wonder how effective her game would be in the modern day, with people just seeming to not really respect her much from a game front, and not really think she's even really playing the game, despite, again, her having good social bonds in the house and her having really strong jury management moving forward. I do think this perception of her being this crazy, kooky player would be one that would be a bit tough for her to really gain respect from in the modern day, but it obviously does work for her on this season. But anyway, it all leads up to the eviction, where we do get a funny speech from Marvin, who uses it to thank Halle Berry and says that he's single, while Jace ends up giving Diane Holly's ceramic cat, which he gave to her as a bad luck charm. But either way, Jace is evicted in a 6-1 vote, leading to a very awkward interview once again, with Holly showing up at the end of it, very much implying that they're going to try to be in a relationship moving forward, despite the fact that she didn't even know that he lived in LA until he tells her this during the interview, with it seeming like they don't know much about each other at all, which, what do you know? They didn't make it that much further after the season. But with that, we obviously got to talk about Jace, who is obviously a massive star on this season, really the main character of the first half of the season, where he gets the most amount of confessionals during the first half of the season by quite a bit, to where, despite him being obviously a relatively early boot here, it's not really that big of a surprise that he ends up later returning for Big Brother All-Stars, considering just how massive a presence he was on this season. We're again mixing in the fact that he's this massive character, and with the fact that he was the first victim of the back door, and him also being this pretty aggressive player in the game as well. Like, it really just makes him a perfect candidate for later return, and someone that also just had a fun role in this season, to where, again, while, again, I do qualm with certain things he said across this season, I do feel like as a whole, he ends up probably being the most dynamic character on this season, probably being one of my favorite pre-jury boots from a character standpoint. But now for week 6, which probably ends up being one of the more dynamic weeks of the season. Now, I'll start off with an HOH comp that is essentially a skills comp of having to shoot a puck closest to the line, with Adria getting a really great shot first that no one ends up beating, leading to her becoming the HOH. And what an HOH it is, with this ending up being probably one of the biggest examples of HOH-itis in Big Brother history, with the twins throughout this week just going on a massive power trip that completely sinks both of their games. And again, up to this point, I've talked about the twins in a way that, again, I do feel like they did get massively disadvantaged by the twin twist, and I don't think it really played them any favors in the game. However, they themselves did not do them any favors in the game, and this is the shining week that really exemplifies all of that. But coming into this week, we see Adria being pretty loyal to the Twin Alliance, and also see her do some decent work here in pulling in Cowboy, who's now alone in the game due to obviously Jace going, and him actually being anti-Drew at this point, with us even getting a weird confessional from him wanting to get revenge for Jace and take out Drew himself, which is something that obviously never happens. But obviously the twins and Michael end up having a good relationship here, largely due to their shared religious beliefs. But through this, they end up adding him as a number to the Twin Alliance, giving them the outright majority at this point, putting the twins in what seems like a pretty powerful position. But through that, also ends up paying dividends for Cowboy's game as well, with obviously this relationship with Adria and Natalie really ending up leading to them rooting for him by the end of the game, and really ends up being one of the only reasons why he has a semblance of a chance at winning at the end of the game. But here Adria immediately wants to target Marvin as the biggest talker in the game, though we then do see some campaigning from Diane, where she interestingly puts the target more so onto the Will, Karen, Nokomis trio, by mentioning that they were looking worried when Adria won HOH, and has her now considering taking the shot now, with her wanting to put up Karen, which has her considering taking the shot now, with Diane in particular wanting her to target Karen, which would have been a great move for Diane. I mean, separating Karen and Nokomis, who is Diane's probably closest ally at this point outside the twins and Drew, and also making this move allows her to maintain this position in the middle, with the twins getting all the blood on their hands, to where at this point in the game, Diane is in a really impressive spot, right in the middle of the house, again in between these two sides, and is a pretty central figure within the Twin Alliance itself. For here, she has obviously the bond with Drew, but also has the closer game relationship with the twins than Drew does. So again, she's in a really strong spot here, and this move really ends up being one that has her exerting her will. So again, it puts her in a really great spot, though again, she doesn't end up sticking to the plan she set forward here. Though to be fair, neither does Adria fully, where again, this is where we get the start of her HOH-itis, where we do see Adria telling Karen she's going to nominate someone from their own side, though also proceeds to just not tell her the rest of the plan, which, I mean, I get she wants to keep Cowboy and Drew safe, obviously. And if Cowboy and Drew are not going on the block, then really one of her former allies do have to go on the block. But I don't get the point here in just not being more open with what she's doing here, as really just sows even more distrust between her and her old alliance, where they get upset at her for not even talking through noms with them. Where again, they would have been annoyed for sure if one of them had to go up as a pawn, but I think they would have been understanding had they talked through the plan. And this leads to the likes of Karen and Will very much comparing her to Jace across this week. Obviously a negative connotation, though interestingly they decide to not put Karen up here, as they think Karen will lose it if she gets on the block, and instead decide to nominate Will, to which they claim that they're nominating Will because they were led by an important power that made this decision, which rightfully gets called out on the show, as essentially through this she is claiming that God told her to nominate the black guy and the gay guy, with also her saying that God told her that Will is a good liar. All this is again terrible optics, and really just the constant use of religion to justify their game moves ends up being one of the more frustrating aspects of watching the twins play this game. But obviously with Marvin and Will on the block, we then get to the veto pick, where Adria picks Drew, again, not her own sister, as she wants to test if the other two will pick her sister. And what do you know? They don't, because why would they? Especially when you just nominated them. And again, to Adria, this is once again justifying her decision making and making her believe that they're not loyal to her because of this. But all leads up to the veto comp, a Christmas themed comp for some reason, which is almost entirely luck of having to pick gifts that have points inside, and you have to reveal one of them to the other players, though you can switch one of your point cards with another, and you can also later take a risk in taking a stocking, where inside the stockings, there's the chance of getting 10 bonus points or having 10 points taken away from you, or also getting a prize, with the prizes being an MP3 player and a digital camera, which seems kind of lame. But again, this is something that modern Big Brother simply would not do. I mean, this is again literally a comp where it's almost entirely luck. It's a comp where like almost anybody can win. There's no real skill to much of what's going on here, but through that, it kind of makes it very refreshing to see here. But anyway, Adria ends up winning the veto here, essentially just adding even more to her power trip. We're following this, we see Adria now talking about needing to think about the jury, and that the first juror will have a lot of influence in how the game plays out, and how you don't want to send someone to the jury first that'll be pissed off at you, which is an interesting strategic thought that does get mentioned in the modern day of this actually being a thing. Though again, it's funny that the twins are the first to vocalize this on the show, and it's also funny considering they just completely botched the execution of this and instead do the complete opposite of what they're talking about here. Though again, this does seem to deter them from wanting to take out Marvin, with them looking at Marvin as someone that will be influential on the jury. So instead, the twins now talk about using the veto on Marvin, as they worry that obviously he'll go home if he stays on the block. Only for when they go on to tell him this, he proceeds to pick a fight with them, calling them spineless, which he does to numerous people on this season, and accuses them of nominating him due to race, which, to be fair, that is fair, but it's not optimal gameplay, where she obviously strays away from the idea of using the veto on him because of this. Meanwhile, Will also doesn't want the veto to be used on him, and with him also being clearly pissed at them and telling the others that he's going to be targeting them, I feel like Will also ends up playing this pretty terribly. So again, it is funny that Adria really wants to use this veto because she is on that much of a power trip that where she just wants to use it for the sake of it, just to demonstrate the power she has in the game, only for both nominees to just not even want her to do it. So where now we get to the point where Adria again goes on a different type of power trip, to where now, instead of wanting to veto you, she now wants the sole vote to evict. She wants the vote to come down to a tie so that she can be the one that makes the decision. Because she even says in the DR, this whole week is going to be about Adria. So again, we actively see her campaigning to make the vote a tie before the veto is even used, which is just super funny. Let's just see how drunk with power she has gotten in this game. So again, we see Diane talk about how this is actually good for her game, for Adria to break the tie, though we do see her also struggling with the vote itself, being much closer to Will than she is with Marvin, and despite seemingly recognizing that Will going is better for her game, we do actually see her waver on this, and seemingly gets paranoid over the twins getting closer to Drew than they are with her. And I mean, to be fair, the twins also did make a bit of a misstep this week by revealing to Will that they had support from their own alliance, clearly indicating that Diane was on board, essentially throwing her under the bus, which through all this leads to Diane flipping back to Will, Karen, and Nokomis, which just feels really sloppy, of her just completely burning her relationship with the twins, 2 jury votes in that instance, after having literally been the reason why they made this move to begin with, which all of this obviously leads to this very frosty relationship between the twins and Diane by the end of the season. But again, also just feels like a bit of a misguided move here. It feels like a situation where she's flipping to a power structure that doesn't benefit her. Again, the Twin Alliance was a perfect landing spot for her, especially if she didn't burn her relationship with the twins. So while yes, you do have to worry if you get to the very end of the game with them, especially having the twins together at the very end, but again, they're going to be split up along the way. While flipping back to the Will, Nokomis, Karen side of things, again, like, yeah, she has good relationships with Will and Nokomis, but they're all closer to each other than they are with her. They all also have already started to distrust her, along with the fact that Karen in particular was never particularly that close to Diane. So again, she flips here in a position I just don't think it's good for her game, and I think it's largely due to the fact that she just started to not like the twins, and again, did not like the power trip they were going on, which again is fair, but I do think it is suboptimal play here. Anyway, through this week, we also get a luxury comp to watch Without a Paddle, which I'm sure they were happy about that. But the challenge is playing out in a funny way, where Nokomis is on a team with the twins, ends up throwing the comp so that she doesn't have to spend more time with them, while Drew, Diane, and Will end up winning here. Drew and Diane getting their first movie date. For also through this week, we also get a lot more focus on the Drew-Diane relationship, with us getting having a lot of talk about how Diane is clearly more into him than he is into her, which is a notion that I actually think translates into the game as well. I think this leads to a lot more frustrations from the jury, how Diane plays the end of her game, with them interpreting her game moves as moves she's obviously making for Drew's sake, while they perceive Drew to just be playing her the entire time. Now also here we get bizarre segments, like one about Drew shaving his chest hair, and we also get one about Diane tanning too much. But anyway, it leaves up to the eviction, where we do get a live vote for the first time this season. So while I do criticize the modern live votes and the fact that, like, why do we have to watch 13 people vote in week 1? It just wastes a lot of time in the show, which again is kind of the point. But I think something to at least credit them with is at least they know how to get in and out pretty quickly between votes, where here it was very much a drag, just waiting for each person to go into the diary room, which just took forever. But anyway, here we do see Drew and Michael siding with the twins in voting out Will, while Karen, Diane, and Nokomis end up voting for Marvin, leading to the tie that Adria had been wanting, where she ends up voting out Will here, shocking Marvin in the process, with again him assuming that this entire week was a ploy to blindside him, which, to be fair, is Marvin every week. But we do get a fun exit from Will here, with him pushing away Natalie's hug and telling Adria that if karma's a boomerang, I'll be seeing you sooner than later. To which Adria's confused by this, to which he ends up repeating the phrase as he leaves, only for us to later find out that Adria doesn't know what he's talking about because she doesn't know what karma is, thinking that he's talking about Karma Electra, which is like, what? And also it ends up saying that she doesn't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, which is like, what do you think? Anyway, taking out Will obviously is a terrible move for Adria, and obviously just the twins in general. It's obviously her breaking her promise to her initial alliance right in front of the entire house, which those that she betrays here ends up holding a vendetta against them for really the rest of Twins' runs here, where they really end up weaponizing the Will vote here against them, making them the consensus targets for the following round. And again, the big issue here really just stems from how they ran their HOH, where through them going on this massive power trip, they really end up turning Diane away, having Diane flip to the other side, empowering the other side to come after them, but even then just further increase the targets on their backs by making this move. Oh well, this was a great move for Drew, with him being able to weaken the Pinky Swear alliance by sniping Will out of the game here while getting no blood on his hands. He comes out of this still having the allegiance to the twins and to Cowboy, but also to Diane, while also having the twins in front of him as shields, and also still having Diane protecting him in the game, putting him in a really strong position in the game to where, despite some pretty bad HOH results in the following rounds, he ends up still being in a strong position to run the table down the road, with him having a pretty easy path to the end game no matter who wins power, and him having a good chunk of win equity alongside that. But with that, we obviously lose Will. And again, Will's a player that I very much sympathize with on the rewatch here. I do think you could very much clearly tell how the men were a bit homophobic towards him. And again, like him going out now due to Adria telling him that God told her to nominate him. Again, that's all just really icky. But again, I do think he is a strong player for the most part. I mean, again, he does put together this core three early on with Lori and Karen, later replacing Lori with Nokomis, and they were probably one of the most solid alliances of the season, where they never once considered fully loyal to each other and having a lot of power in the game. And for a lot of the game up to this point, I do feel like Will was probably one of the best positioned players in the house. Or again, despite the fact that he didn't like the likes of Jace and Scott, they still seem to look at Will as someone that they could work with. Now again, I do think his final week here is a bit rough. I do think the fact that he was just kind of openly targeting the twins, and that information obviously gets back to them, is pretty bad. But again, a lot of that is perpetuated by the fact that the twins nominated him for dumb reasons. And again, on the rewatch here, I just really liked Will. I did find him to be a fun presence on the show, with him having some great confessionals, him just being an all-around sympathetic figure on the show. But with that, we now move on to week 7, which ends up starting a bit of a slow stretch for the season, to where, again, these next 2 weeks are obviously pretty baseline strategically, but I still found them entertaining to watch, despite not too much changing gameplay wise. But either way, we get the HOH, which is a Q&A over the evicted players, where Nally and Cowboy are literally the first out of this competition, being a really terrible result for the twins. There's something funny about this comp. Okay, we keep on seeing people get answers wrong continuously, which is just really funny through this comp. But anyway, it does come down to Nokomis versus Diane, where Nokomis wins the tiebreaker, essentially meaning that the twins are screwed. But this week does start with the twins still being on a massive high horse after the previous eviction, with Adria talking about how she's happy that they weren't in the position that she was in, and that it takes a lot of strength to do what she did, and says that everything that happened last week was her on her own, and thank you for letting it all be me. Well, we then also cut to Natalie, who talks about how Will is going to have to live with himself for the rest of his life, which is like, okay, I guess. But it's funny that Adria comes into this round thinking that Drew is the target for some reason. Don't get how she doesn't recognize that she betrayed her own alliance that would make her a target. But instantly we see Nokomis talking about how Adria owes her a finger, because obviously she broke her pinky swear, which again does seem juvenile. The entire basis around this women's alliance was around a pinky swear they made. Where it is at this point in the show, where we do flash back to week 2 and them formally making this group, where now Adria has obviously been the first to take a shot at their own group. And again, we do see Diane, Nokomis, Karen, and Marvin really villainize Natalie and Adria from this point forward, essentially putting the game on hold for the sake of getting rid of the twins. Mostly because they didn't like them, along with the fact that they wanted to get revenge for Will. Again, Leans is pretty stagnant 2 weeks of the game, but Nokomis ends up targeting Adria in particular, with there being debate over who to put her up against, with Natalie campaigning to try to avoid the block, as that would open up the chance of both of them staying. But she obviously nominates both the twins as expected, as again, you can't really leave one off the block if you're actually trying to get rid of them. But it's when getting nominated, we do have Nokomis giving a speech about how they're nominated because they broke promises, to which the twins end up laughing at it and are annoyed, saying that that's a cop-out, to where they say they wanted a personal reason. This isn't a good reason, I guess. To again, Natalie's again on her high horse, talking about how I watched my wording with Will and I never went back on my word with him, which again just feels like them not owning their move. And we do just see them being really passive-aggressive over the course of the rest of the day, to where Nokomis eventually confronts them, to which they, again, still say that they're confused over why they're on the block. To which Nokomis says, again, you broke a promise, only for A to say that she is crazy for putting them on the block for breaking trust when she didn't break trust. Again, like, you literally just betrayed your alliance. Like, what do you mean? And this leads to the twins comparing Will to Charles Manson, having people inside the house that are still killing people, I guess. And again, it's funny how they legitimately don't see how this is a bizarre comment to be making, to where when Natalie eventually meets Will in the jury house, literally this is one of the first things she says to him, is how she was comparing him to Charles Manson, as if that's okay. And again, this is followed up by Natalie and Adria then confronting Diane, who is again still upset at her not giving a personal reason for why she's on the block, and that it's a cop-out. And this scene really just shows you the tactics that the twins use, of them trying to gaslight people by barraging them together and mixing that with the tactics that they use of weaponizing the Bible as well. It really just leads to a lot of people coming out of this season not respecting how they play the game. Or even the pre-jury, we had people like Holly being upset at them for using these tactics. Again, from this point on, it really ends up infuriating most of the people that are left in the game. But through this week, we also see Drew continuing to play both sides, still working with the twins and Cowboy, and in an ideal world, he would have wanted to keep all of them around, but is also still working alongside Diane as well. Where at this point, Diane, Karen, and Nokomis all plan on taking him to the end game, as they looked at as like two duos getting to the final 4 together, which it's kind of insane that they do just seem to forgo the concept of targeting Diane and Drew before the end game, despite being again a very known showmance. But eventually we do see Drew and Cowboy being picked to play for the veto by the twins, where we actually do see Cowboy talking about wanting to use the veto to save the twins, with the hope that Marvin would go on the block, which would have probably never happened, considering again they knew that Marvin could potentially go home in that instance, which again probably was never going to happen. I mean, while Marvin for sure was looked at as more expendable than Drew, they were also aware that Marvin would probably go home if he went up on the block, to where 100% this would have backfired on them, to where I do think Drew would have been the renom had Cowboy used the veto. But again, it's at least nice to see Cowboy at least consider making a move here, something that he doesn't really do all season. But anyway, the veto itself ends up being Morphomatic, the first face morph competition, which becomes a staple over the next few seasons. Here we see Adria really dominate this comp, getting first by over 2 minutes. But through that, obviously the main target for the week is safe, though obviously just the target falls back on Natalie at this point. But we do get a lot of debate over who to renom, where again, putting up Marvin leads to worry about Drew and Cowboy taking him out, which they probably would have. While the same happens with Drew, where there's the worry that Marvin would want to take out Drew to weaken Diane, meaning that they settle on Cowboy. Though obviously, with Nokomis being the HOH, this leads to her struggling with this decision, as obviously it's her brother. And they also did have a deal back from the very beginning of the season where they agreed to not nominate each other, only for her to now go back on that deal. Which, I mean, is pretty hypocritical, considering her hatred of the twins is due to her breaking a promise. And that's literally what she does here. Though, to be fair, I mean, she does ask Cowboy for permission, which he reluctantly gives, though is clearly annoyed at going up. And also, again, to be fair, she's not targeting Cowboy. He's obviously going up as pawn, where he should be pretty lock safe. But again, Adria ends up using the veto on herself, which actually wasn't even a guarantee coming into this, as there was talk about using it on Natalie instead, though came to the conclusion that Adria had a better shot in the game moving forward. To which we have Adria giving a speech about giving Natalie a chance for the wonderful person that she is. And in that moment, we literally get a cut to Diane laughing, which is, again, not great jury management there. Anyway, Nokomis ends up nominating Cowboy, to where we do see the twins obviously campaign here to Drew and Diane to get back together to Twin Alliance. And surprisingly, Drew seems to actually be considering this. And truth be told, I could definitely see some merit to making this move. I mean, obviously keeping the twins in the game keeps two targets in front of you, two targets that are probably going to take you to the end. Actively striving for a final three with him if Cowboy is gone, while also, again, if one of the twins goes out along the way, they're taking Drew to the end where he will easily beat them. So yeah, I think there is merit to this move for Drew, though it is interesting to see him consider making a move that would lead to Cowboy being taken out of the game, considering he had a final two with Cowboy from early on, and obviously that ends up being the final two of the season. Though what really stops this plan from moving forward in any way is the fact that Diane is not on board. And I mean, to be fair, I do think at the end of the day, I do come down to the fact that this is probably a move that's not even really worth making. So again, it is definitely a big move, though there's simply just not that much benefit in keeping around Natalie over Cowboy, where again, Cowboy is also someone that will take Drew to the end. And through making this move, you obviously burn your relationship with Nokomis and Karen, while you do have an extra shield in front of you. You also do harm that personal connection there, and potentially the respect that they have for you. So again, I think at the end of the day, I probably would have also probably leaned towards not making the move, though I do, again, think it's a move worth at least considering. But what is funny about this entire debate here is, again, we do have Drew and Diane arguing over this plan in the bathroom, only for us to get the reveal that Cowboy was on the toilet the entire time, and he ends up interrupting this conversation, which they just pretend like it's their first couple argument, which Drew ends up playing off to him as if it's Diane that wanted him out instead, to which Drew later plays off to Cowboy that it was Diane that wanted him out instead, which, I mean, to be fair, is believable, as Diane had been targeting Cowboy for a while in the game, and constantly had been wanting him out throughout the entire season, which is humorous considering how many opportunities she had to do it and never actually went through with it any of those times. This week does also kind of emphasize a lot of the annoyances that people did have with Cowboy, where when he's on the block, he does end up utilizing a lot of sob stories, trying to gain sympathy through his campaign, and really the house ended up being kind of annoyed at him for doing so whenever he was nominated, and through that ended up losing him even more respect in the game. Also through this week, we get a few weirder segments from like the twins having their own language, leading to this ridiculous montage of them just making weird noises while talking to each other. We have Drew and Diane making out and both complaining about each other's kissing techniques. We get a segment about Marvin's smelly feet and how he sleeps in a room by himself because he stinks so bad. We also get a food competition where they all get their favorite meals to eat, only for them to then have to blend them into a drink and drink it, which is disgusting. We also get a luxury comp this week of them getting an Amazon shopping spree, which is weird to see Amazon from back in 2004. But Diane ends up winning a $1,000 gift card, while they also get the privilege of buying 14 items for the house. And again, looking at the options that they had, I mean, there seemed to be this pretty big disparity between the price and most of the items. We pretty much see them going for every expensive item on the board, including a fire pit, which they proceed to use to burn Holly's cat, seemingly out of spite there. But here we also get an America's Vote for a house guest to guest star on an episode of Young and the Restless, which just so happens to be Marvin's favorite soap opera, and he ends up winning the vote here, though interestingly by a very slim margin to where Drew was only a percentage behind him, which very much makes me believe that Drew is actually the true fan favorite at this point, with Marvin obviously getting a bit of a boost due to the fact that he was a fan of the show and I campaigned for it, while Drew didn't really want it that bad. And again, this is a pretty surreal scene of seeing Marvin on set and meeting all the actors and just, again, awkwardly flirting with pretty much every woman he meets along the way. And we do get this funny moment of him practicing one of his only lines over and over and over again, of him just continuously saying, "You got it, damn it," over and over in different ways. But anyway, obviously this all culminates in the eviction, it being a 4-1 vote where Natalie goes home, to which she says that she will pray for Nokomis, because that's Natalie for you, and talks about in her interview that she's upset at her for taking her out due to vengeance over strategy, because in this instance those two things are very separate. But I mean, to be fair, we do get some pretty poor jury management from the likes of Nokomis and Diane and their goodbye messages, with Nokomis calling her out for lying and not admitting to it, while Diane says she can't even bother to tell the two apart, which is not a good look. But either way, with this we lose Natalie, and truth be told, I don't feel like I know much about Natalie, which, I mean, again, is kind of a mirror for overall game on this season and how it was affected by the twin twists, where, again, like, at the end of the day, I just think she kind of blends in with Adria on this season. I feel like it's tough to distinguish the two, and what really makes Natalie different from Adria. For again, we hear on the show talk about how she has a more domineering personality, but we never really see that. Though again, I think Natalie was someone that, again, kind of gets screwed over in the game. Again, being a person that has to be reintroduced to everybody halfway through the game is a very tough position to be in, and mixing down the fact that, again, she also was the backup target this week. She was even the initial target. Like, I do think there are some unlucky circumstances that leads to me giving a little bit of grief to Natalie's game, at least a comparison to Adria's, though, again, still very flawed player. I mean, while Adria was the one that obviously won the massive power trip, Natalie was right beside her and was really encouraging to do all the things that she did. And again, I think Natalie plays just as poor of a game as Adria by the end of it, with just how much of a high horse Natalie seemed to be on. But with that, we get to week 8, which actually ends up being a shorter week on the show, only containing 2 episodes, which was probably for the better, as again, it was a pretty straightforward week gameplay-wise, with the HOH comp being a golfing challenge, one that Marvin ends up winning here, which ends up being an interesting result on paper, where, again, no one seems to know actually what Marvin is going to do, where again, most people were expecting Adria to be targeted coming into this week, though there's also talk about targeting Drew and Diane instead, with him looking at them as a powerful duo in the game. He had also previously talked about wanting Drew on the block at some point, where he's the only one to have never been nominated, which is something that matters to Marvin. Also, there's talk about putting up Cowboy, considering the fact that he hated Cowboy, and we also see talk about Karen possibly going on the block, as he had previously nominated her, though by this point in the game they were relatively close. Along with the fact that we also get to talk about possibly nominating Nokomis and Diane is another pretty powerful duo. And again, it just feels like Marvin could have gone anywhere here, considering Marvin had no connections in the game, which is again just the issue of Marvin's game. And it's strange too, because like there's a lot of talk on this season about how strong of a player Marvin is, and a lot of talk about how he's this very savvy strategic player. Yeah, I really just don't see any of that. Yes, he is thinking strategically. I think his strategy is terrible, as we see with how this week plays out. Though again, here we do see Adria thinking that once again that she's safe, thinking that he's gonna go for Drew and Diane instead, while Diane worries that he'll put her up, though talks about how the perfect scenario for the week would be him putting up Adria and Cowboy, to which Nokomis shuts it down, saying that's no way that's gonna happen because Marvin's not dumb enough. Where again, Adria is the only shield in front of him at this point, and through taking her out, he's also keeping this power structure together, that would immediately come after him for the following round. So again, there's no way he's dumb enough to do this, right? But no, he is. He does want Adrian Cowboy up, saying that he's doing it because of his own promise with Will during his eviction week, but also claiming that he wants to do this because he'll buy him another week in the game and that she's the biggest threat, which that doesn't even make sense. Again, I don't get how she's the biggest threat. I mean, she can't win a jury vote. Everyone hates her. Where no matter how she gets to the end, she'll have 4 completely anti-votes against her. And yeah, you could say, okay, she'll win challenges, and if she does, she'll come for Marvin. But again, everyone is doing that next week. Like, that's just a commonly assumed thing that Marvin's going to be the target the following week. And he should have been spending this week rebuilding his relationship with Adria and making a deal with her and keeping her in the game. But instead, he decides to just make a deal with Diane to keep himself safe, making a final 2 with her. The only real deal he ends up making in the back portion of the game, which just really, again, shows you how simple-minded Marvin's gameplay was. But again, Marvin looks at Diane as the most powerful person in the game right now, with him seeming to be one of the few players that actually has a lot of respect for how Diane plays this season. But again, it just shows him thinking this one deal with Diane, who, again, has deals with everyone left in the game, especially after Adria goes outside of Cowboy. But again, it just shows that he thinks that this one deal with Diane, who again has deals with literally everybody in the house after Adria goes outside of Cowboy, is actually going to save him the following week. Though, I mean, through making this deal, we do actually see Karen being annoyed at Diane for making this deal, which did seem to be the start of Karen's distrust in Diane that plays a major factor into the end game. Now, along with that, Karen gets a lot of focus this week, where we do see her gameplay being highlighted a bit more, thus seeing her relationship with Adria, where despite her being one of the bigger proponents about needing the twins out of the game, she also still ends up maintaining one of the stronger relationships with Adria, to where Adria does end up picking Karen for the veto here, and Adria does campaign to her to use the veto, only for Karen to do her own thing of saying that she's scared of using it as it's bad for her, which, while it does work out for her and maintaining Adria's respect by the end of the week, I do feel like this act that she puts up here really makes her come off as a scared player, one that is unwilling to make a move, and also builds this weak perception that, again, I think a modern jury would simply not respect. Where, again, the way that Karen phrases this really makes it come off as she's doing this due to fear of what others would do to her, outside of it being for more strategic reasons. The third is we do see Karen saying that she won't throw the comp, but she's already on a losing streak. Talking about being a chronic loser, those who fare a major part of Karen's strategy on this season is throwing comps, her wanting to do so to not put a bullseye on her back while also not showing her cards, which is something that she proceeds to do even following this in the season. Even though I think it's actually bad for her to continue doing this later in the season. Anyway, we get to the veto, where the challenge is getting a veto symbol outside of a block of ice using a water gun, where right away it comes down to Karen and Adria, this being a comp that Karen can actually win, giving her her first comp win, which in doing so essentially guarantees that Adria goes home, which I don't get why Karen won this. I mean, I don't know why she went as hard as she did to make sure that Adria went home this week, where, again, there are just so many other options. So, again, she was probably safe had the veto been used, and Adria is, again, in her corner. So I do feel like this was a strange decision to be made here. Not an entirely bad one, as Adria does have bonds with Drew and Cowboy as well, who are obviously not working with her, and through keeping her in the game, it does potentially empower Drew and Cowboy, potentially takes out one of her closer allies, though also I do think there's still a serious chance that Cowboy just goes home this week, which would have been very beneficial to her game. But either way, we obviously see Adria being upset at Karen for not using the veto on her, with Adria being upset that people don't live up to their agreements. Again, Adria saying this. Again, saying that she will pray for these people every day as they need it, because that's Adria for you. And again, through this, Adria doesn't have much of a chance of staying, with people ending up avoiding her and even deeming her the plague. She has campaigned to Karen and Drew, with her saying that she wants to help them win the game, to which Karen responds that by saying that she's not thinking that far ahead, because again, that's Karen for you. Again, playing this weak persona a bit too too strong from my point of view. But again, we do once again see Drew actually consider flipping the vote here on Cowboy to keep Adria in the game. Though again, for Drew, I don't think it's really worth it. Though again, I do think you could argue it would be better for Karen in particular to take out Cowboy. Being someone directly against her in the game, though considering her closest ally in Nokomis, would obviously be upset if she went through this. Again, it wouldn't be worth it unless she got Nokomis also on board. But following this week, we do get a lot of focus around the drama surrounding the Drew and Diane relationship, where Diane becomes annoyed at Adria and Drew, or Diane gets annoyed at Drew becoming closer to Adria, and again gets paranoid because he isn't talking to her as much. With this week also containing a pretty big situation that causes a fracture between the two, where we do get portrayed on the show here as this really bizarre strategy from Marvin, where despite him having the shot at breaking up Drew and Diane this week and not deciding to go through with it, he does still decide to try to actually break them up by literally walking up to Diane and kissing her while she's drunk. Again, on the forehead, to be fair. But again, he tries to use this as a way to make Drew jealous and have Drew and Diane not working together anymore beyond this, which again, from a personal standpoint, this is just very icky. For him to be walking up and kissing Diane without her permission while she was intoxicated. But again, the show portraying this as Marvin is making this mastermind move, when again, this is disgusting behavior, but also from a game perspective, this is even good for his game. Where obviously this breakup wasn't going to last, they never do, and all Marvin is doing is just adding more animosity between him and Drew, with Drew now being even more gung-ho about wanting to go for Marvin the following week, and him citing this as a reason to go for Marvin. So again, I just found this to be a completely ridiculous plan, and one that he actually already went through with earlier in the season, which at the time it did cause a tiff between the two, but again, they came back together anyway, which is part of the reason why Drew wanted to target Marvin in week 3, which makes you question again why he wanted to do it again. But again, this does lead to Drew being annoyed with Diane for the next few days, which plays into following week's nominations. But again, this was just never going to be something that would actually benefit Marvin's game. And it does again just make me feel bad for Diane and her taken advantage of by Marvin in this instance, to where it leads to Drew breaking up with her for something that she doesn't even remember happening. Now beyond that, in this week, we do get a couple other notable segments based around like Nokomis' piercings and how she's a sexpert. Also, we get America's Vote for A Call From Home, with Cowboy obviously winning that, to which we obviously get a melodramatic segment of him talking to his stepson, who he constantly talks about on the show. But it all obviously culminates in a unanimous Adria eviction, with Adria giving a speech on her way out about how she's happy, she's upheld to who she is, and that they're all in her prayers, saying that she's learned who she will and won't vote for, and that goes for Natalie as well, leading to Marvin picking a fight with her on her way out, saying, "I thought you guys were separate," and he calls her pompous and says that you came into the house lying. Yet all this terrible jury management, though to be fair, still made for a really fun TV moment. But through this, we also have Diane not even being at the door at the time of the eviction, which is also not a great look, where again, the twins end up being extremely bitter at both Marvin and Diane, alongside also Nokomis as well, to which it really ends up harming their jury prospects moving forward, while also ends up giving Karen a lot of win equity moving forward, alongside Drew, and actually gives Cowboy a winning shot in most scenarios, where again, the twins come out of the house being very pro-Cowboy, with Drew and Karen being the only other two people that they would even want to vote for. With that, we do lose Adria, who again, just like Natalie, again, on a massive high horse, played the game terribly towards the end, but really that to another extreme, where again, it is a lot on Adria of what happens during the HOH week. She's the one that is HOH. She's the one that makes a lot of the decisions. While again, Natalie definitely backs her through all that, it is Adria that is getting the brunt of the blame for all the things that they're doing, is the one that is actually going in, winning the comps and making the decisions and telling people to allow her to vote in the tie. And again, I do think that is a lot on Adria. Now, I think earlier on in the game, I do think there are good points in her game. Again, the fact that she was involved in the Pinky Swear Alliance to begin with, the fact that she later formed the Twin Alliance and pulled in Cowboy, the fact that she was able to convince Scott to keep her around. Again, there are definitely good things for Adria's game, but I think the last few weeks of her game are just truly abysmal. And again, just doesn't come off as a particularly likable person through the tactics that her and her sister used in the game. And just again, also her just not taking any responsibility for her actions either. So while obviously she has a major impact on the season and does cause for a lot of drama on the season, it obviously very much came at the expense of her game and also her likability across the season. But with that, let's move on to week 9, which ends up being a double eviction week. Obviously the prototype for what would later become a proper double eviction, which doesn't appear until BB7, though weeks like this do occur periodically across the next few seasons, where the first round of the week takes place over the course of only the first 2 days, with the nominations taking place later that night, leading to the eviction occurring in the following episode, still making this a very fast-paced round of gameplay. Now, the HOH itself ends up being a weird Q&A comp that involves mixing liquids to answer the questions, which just felt like kind of an unnecessary aspect of it. But either way, Drew ends up beating Karen at the very end, with Karen throwing the challenge, which was probably not the optimal move here, as obviously she knows that Marvin is going to be a big target for this round, though in the case that Marvin ends up winning the veto, and she could have potentially been in a lot of danger, her or Nokomis. And even then, even just the mere targeting of Marvin over the potential of targeting Drew or Diane is also pretty detrimental to her game. But anyway, Drew and Cowboy talk about targeting Marvin due to the events of the previous week, though Cowboy does talk about the worry of how close Nokomis and Karen are, which, I mean, straight up, I do think Marvin is probably not the optimal target for Drew this week, which, I mean, again, like, no matter what, Nokomis and Karen were coming for them the following round, where, while Cowboy probably would have been the target, again, Drew would have been the backup target, to where I do think it is definitely a lot more dangerous of a position keeping both Nokomis and Karen over keeping the likes of Marvin, who is a much bigger shield to use at Final 5. Though again, I do also get the fact that Marvin is also someone that's probably going to go for Drew or Cowboy at this point. But also, I feel like knowing the endgame structure of Big Brother at this point, I do feel like that structure does benefit the likes of Nokomis and Karen more so than Marvin, where I do not see Marvin being able to win a lot of these endgame comps. So again, as a whole, I do feel like this move is a bit misguided. But through this, we do end up seeing Cowboy tell Drew that he doesn't want to be the pawn, to which Drew says that he'll never put him up. Where from this point on the show, it is very much shown as Drew and Cowboy working together at this point. And while again, I do very much question Drew's actual loyalty to Cowboy throughout this endgame, I do feel like this is kind of the point where you can kind of see their working relationship really solidify. But anyway, Drew's entire mantra around his HOH here is the fact that he just wants no one mad at him, which is ironic considering who he ends up deciding to pick as his other nominee. But anyway, Karen does some pretty effective campaigning this week, using Marvin's plan to put Drew on the block just because he hasn't been nominated before against him, to which we then cut to the Diane side of things, where Diane is happy that Drew won the HOH in a position where she probably shouldn't be, as Drew is now upset at Diane for not telling him this information, leading to this very weird argument between the two, where like Diane doesn't even understand why Drew is upset at her, and Drew talks about how she's changed and is obviously still upset at her for Marvin having kissed her, and this all leads to Diane saying, "Put me on the block," to where she volunteers to leave the game, and what do you know, he does nominate Diane, obviously alongside Marvin, of Marvin once again calling him spineless, while he does openly say in his speech that he doesn't trust Diane, leading up to a following conversation in the HOH room, where Drew reveals that this was all a ploy, I guess? A ploy of trying to make it look like they're not close anymore, saying it was for game reasons, kind of feeling very much like the prototype for the Dan's funeral of it all. But really, I don't feel like this plays that major a factor into things, especially considering their spot is kind of blown by the next week anyway. And again, it kind of feels like this is a move that, again, plays into the notion of Drew not wanting to piss anyone off, as he knows he can win Diane back, but just feels kind of misguided to put up one of your closest allies on the block anyway if you do actually want to go to the end with Diane. And what's funny about all this too is that he tells Diane the reason why he did this without getting her permission first is because he didn't want to tell her, as she doesn't have good enough acting skills for this plan, which is funny considering she was literally trying to become an actress at this point. But again, we do follow this up with the DR from him saying that he doesn't fully trust her and that he never will, which is again strange DR here, especially considering, again, I do believe he still was intending to go at least to final 3 with Diane, to where, again, I do find myself a bit perplexed on what exactly Drew is thinking at this point in the game, and if he was actually that willing to actually potentially send Diane home here, even though realistically Diane was probably safe no matter what played out here. But anyway, we do have Drew telling Diane to not use the veto if she wins. Again, just a thing that people think is okay on this season, I guess, to where Diane promises not just Drew, but to the entire cast that she won't use the veto. Which, I mean, I'll say, why are these people believing that she's actually telling the truth here? As, again, who wouldn't use the veto on themselves, especially after the Marcel situation? But also, why is Diane promising this to begin with this obviously ending up backfiring on her? Or Karen ends up being annoyed at Diane for later using the veto, which ends up fracturing their relationship, though, again, it's also just dumb of Karen to be upset at her for doing so anyway. Anyway, we get to the veto comp, which is one where you have to bounce a ball into 6 targets, clearly feeling like a challenge they changed at the last second, with each lane having a player's name above it and pictures of them, only for that to not play a factor into the actual competition. Now, I'm not saying this was like rigged in any sort of way. I think it simply is a situation where the initial challenge probably wasn't working properly, or they just didn't find it entertaining enough to where they changed it at the last second. But anyway, Diane ends up winning the veto here, where again, she ends up using it on herself, though does talk about not taking herself off the block, to which Marvin ends up being upset at her for this, as he wants her off the block so she could try to save him in the game, though obviously that wasn't really her priority at this point. And again, it's funny how like this is all brought up as like Diane has a big decision to make. It's like, does she? But again, she does use the veto and Nokomis goes up as the renom, but again, Marvin's pretty screwed here, and there's really no suspense coming into the vote, with Nokomis saying that Marvin couldn't even save himself if he had a full month. Where again, we get a 3-0 vote, with Marvin just bolting out of the house. And we do get a really awkward interview where he's just like flirting with Julie the entire time, which is strange. But either way, again, we lose Marvin, who is a massive character on this season. I mean, Marvin is incredible TV on paper. Again, I do think he is someone that has incredible one-liners. He has this very distinct way of talking and is a very unique character in Big Brother history, but is also one that, again, like knowing the context around a lot of his actions in the game, it just comes off as like really icky. And the fact that the women were like creeped out by him, and he would be extremely forward in his conversations with them, and again would be called out for sexual harassment, to where again it does like kind of sour me on Marvin. And along with that, again, I just think he's not that good of a player. I mean, outside of the formation of the back door and like his attempt to play the middle, which even then not really doing it that well, considering he's constantly on the block despite that. Like, I don't feel like Marvin played a particularly good game. I don't think he really had that great of a strategic mind in most situations. Like, he feels like the type of player that is just skeptical of literally everything without actually putting much thought into why they're skeptical of those things. So again, like, he's always going to be right at some point, because yeah, there's going to be a lot of points where people are lying to you, but he simply doesn't believe when people are actually telling him the truth either. Again, I just think overall Marvin's a player that I've definitely really soured on from a gameplay perspective as well after this rewatch. But again, he is still an entertaining presence on the show. But either way, with that, we get to the rest of week 9, obviously the final 5 round, which ends up actually being probably one of the most notable rounds of this entire season. Now, it does start off with another Q&A HOH, one based around items that were removed from the house, and we get to see the players noticing it and end up studying them, where really the HOH here ends up being pretty much everybody versus Cowboy, though Cowboy does have a pretty big lead at a point, only to then lose it at the very end, with Nokomis winning HOH. In a situation where Karen did actually try to win this HOH, with Nokomis actually being annoyed at having to win it, as this is a position where at this final 5, they're actually targeting Cowboy for some reason, which, I mean, at this point, that means Nokomis is going against her deal with Cowboy from the beginning of the game. Though it does make you question, why isn't she targeting Drew this week? I mean, Drew's the only person here that she doesn't have a direct deal with. Now, again, she does obviously nominate Drew, but again, for some reason, they decided to target Cowboy instead, even before all the craziness that happened later in this week, to where, again, like, obviously a lot of this is due to Diane's influence, of them obviously not wanting to upset Diane, though, again, it's insane that they would have gone through with that, as that's essentially keeping a pretty powerful duo in the game at the Final Four, again, over having just Diane and Cowboy at Final Four who hate each other. But again, here we do have Cowboy talking to Nokomis, where she does end up lying to him, telling him that she's gonna break the tie to save him, which, I mean, to be fair, at this point, she wasn't necessarily lying, she was just more so thinking that there was no chance of it getting to a tie anyway. But interestingly, Unfortunately, we do end up seeing Karen here actually try to talk some sense at first, talking about how taking out Cowboy is probably not the best option in the game right now. However, Nokomis ends up saying, but there isn't another option, I guess. Only for Karen to now campaign to target Diane, which was never going to happen if Nokomis as HOH, as obviously Nokomis and Diane were extremely close. But even then, a questionable move here as well, to where, I mean, I get the merits of it to a degree of targeting Diane, as Diane and Nokomis are really close, and separating them seems like a decent play for Karen. Though again, that is keeping Drew and Cowboy in the game, where again, that's essentially just keeping another duo in the game. Where again, Karen knows that she's closer to Nokomis than Nokomis is to Diane, to where I still think the optimal move here is to take out Drew to go to the Final Four with both Cowboy and Diane, giving Diane less incentive to flip over, but that's simply just not the way they thought about it here. Which is strange considering, like, earlier in the game, Karen seems to be one of the few people that kind of catches on to the game that Drew is playing, and did talk about targeting him at points in the past. So it's strange that she just doesn't decide to here. And like, really for Karen, I do feel like this is kind of the point where her constant throwing of competitions and like the potential of not using the power back in Final 7 that kind of comes back to bite her. I mean, like, realistically, I think she just should have made the move against Drew and Diane earlier in the game. I think at the time of Final 5 here, again, there weren't many good options left. As again, even though I do think the Diane Cowboy Final Four is the ideal one for her at this point, it's still one where, yeah, Diane and Nokomis are very close. Like, realistically, she should have taken out both Drew and Diane by this point in the game. Possibly had Marvin or Adria at this point in the game instead, which would have greatly benefited her position over the one that she's currently in now. Also through this week, I do feel like Karen gets on a bit of a high horse here, and talking about how, like, she's only targeting Diane because of her telling her that she wasn't going to use the veto on herself, and then she did. Which is, again, it's like, why'd you expect her to do that? And again, 100%, there are other reasons for why you're targeting Diane than that. But following this weekend, an interesting conversation from Cowboy and Drew, where Cowboy ends up talking to Drew about wanting Drew and Diane on the block to where Cowboy can win the veto in order to save the both of them. Essentially, the plan that we see being executed later in the week, which again, it's funny that Cowboy, of all people, is the one that actually bring this up first on the show. Only for us to then cut to Diane, who goes to Drew and essentially just tells him the exact same strategy, that she can win the veto and save him from the block, and through that end up blindsiding Karen. Where again, I do feel like Diane also gets on a bit of a high horse here and talking about how, oh, I've only made a promise to Nokomis, not to Karen. Though at least does admit that, yes, this is a move I'm making to split up Nokomis and Karen, which again is essentially the same thing that Karen wanted to do to her. But they end up agreeing to this plan and also even conduct a smaller plan of like pretending like they're fighting to make Nokomis and Karen feel a bit more comfortable. Though we then proceed to see Diane tell Cowboy this plan, which when doing so, Cowboy's flabbergasted, despite the fact that he literally talked about this plan earlier, which, okay. But there's a funny little moment here, and Diane saying that she'll save Drew, to which Drew then says, or you save Cowboy, obviously being a little moment there of Drew trying to pacify Cowboy. Though I will say also, this conversation here of them talking about this plan is kind of strange in the fact that they do it out in the open, to which, I mean, to be fair, Karen and Nokomis are in the HOH room, but I feel like this is definitely a spot where they could have easily been caught. But at this point, Diane does say that she's doing this because she needs Drew in the game, to where really from this point on, she really ends up going all in on her relationship with Drew. Again, something that I do think ends up harming her perception from the jury, where again, it makes it look like she's being played by Drew. The fact that she's going so far out of the way to make these moves that very much benefit Drew, probably more than it benefits her, again, does end up kind of weakening her standing with the jury, especially considering, again, she's doing all this to essentially keep Cowboy in the game, someone that again she has no real connection to, and again a move that just feels kind of unnecessary for Diane. Now again, I don't disagree with the move of saving Drew with the veto, as again Drew is an important number for her, someone that will potentially take her to the end, especially if Cowboy's not there. But again, keeping Cowboy is just so detrimental to her game. It's keeping in someone that Drew is more likely to take the final two than anyone else in the game, to where again if Cowboy had been taken out, this would essentially guarantee that Drew takes Diane to the end, as he just simply wouldn't have any other option. But essentially by making this move, she gives Drew all the power, and now setting up a final three where Drew is directly in the center of it. And again, like, not to disparage the entire move, as again, I do think there is some merit to it, especially if she's trying to secure Drew's loyalty. And I do think there is some impressive strategic thinking in how this move is executed. But I just don't feel like the way she executed the move here was not the ideal way to do it for Diane here. Anyway, Drew and Cowboy obviously end up being nominated. The first and only time Drew is nominated across this entire season, which is pretty indicative of his pretty impressive positioning in the game. But that we get to the veto challenge, which ends up being Jailbreak. Essentially a challenge that we've seen on Survivor. You having to break out the cage by creating a contraption long enough to get the key. Though the interesting thing here is that the things they have to use here are items from previous challenges, which is a cool callback. Though strangely, this is a challenge that allows them to work together, which is something that is very much beneficial to obviously this alliance that had formed. For obviously here we see them instantly just share items. We see Cowboy give Drew and Diane his golf club, allowing Diane to instantly put together 3 golf clubs, instantly creating something long enough to get the key and almost instantly win this veto, essentially making a mockery of the challenge. And again, in a situation where this does feel one very luck dependent for the likes of Drew and Cowboy, the fact that this challenge obviously completely works to their favor. It's something that most challenges don't even have this component of something that each other can work together on. And the fact that this was a challenge that had that as an option is pretty impressive as well. And also, like, I feel like they kind of gamed the game here to where I feel like from a production standpoint, this was probably a call made on the spot of, I don't think they even thought about the possibility of people working together. I think once they see Diane win the challenge this way, I think they definitely could have potentially called an audible in saying that that's not allowed for people to be working together in that way. Though again, they clearly allow it to happen. Where again, had this been Survivor, I mean, Survivor has this very set rule that in individual challenges, you're not allowed to directly help one another. To where again, I feel like this sets a pretty interesting precedent for Big Brother, and it's obviously being allowed here. But anyway, through this, we do have Karen and Nokomis being confused over how she won that quickly. And also, why was Cowboy helping them? Which obviously should have been a massive tell what was going on here. Though Nokomis doesn't seem bothered by it, saying that there's nothing to worry about. Well, obviously we see Karen being worried, only to be constantly talked down by Nokomis. And straight up, Diane ends up being very cagey in her conversations with the women here, really indirectly warning Nokomis by telling her that she made a promise with Drew to use the veto on him, and constantly ends up reassuring Karen by telling her that she's going to make sure the vote is unanimous, which is clearly her trying to avoid directly saying who she's voting for in that instance. Though she does also just outright lie in saying that Drew promised to keep Karen. So really, I don't get why she went through the whole charade, considering it didn't really matter if Karen knew or not by this point, as again, it was pretty much over. And then really, I just think it ends up being poor jury management with Karen, to where I think Karen leaves the house having less respect for Diane because of this, to which it ends up really lowering Diane's winning chances, with Karen being a pretty integral jury vote, especially against Drew, who she was planning on going to the end with. But anyway, Diane obviously ends up using the veto on Drew, to where Karen is the only possible replacement. So from this point forward, Karen is pretty dead to rights. Though we do end up seeing Nokomis talk about how she's not going to be able to keep Cowboy in the case of a tie anymore, with Cowboy being upset at the fact that Nokomis now wants him out, which does play a factor into the following week. But it is through this that we do see Karen and Nokomis talking about worrying that Karen is the back door. They're claiming that she was backdoored when she gets voted out, which I guess this is where I should talk about the terminology of backdoor, which is obviously overly used in the modern Big Brother landscape, one that now seemingly is associated with just putting someone up after the veto ceremony, regardless of the context behind it. And again, there is this major portion of the superfan community that really sticks to this initial definition of the term backdoor, which was originally used by Marvin, with it being the term that he used to describe his six-finger plan, which through that obviously adds in the context of a person having to be put up after the veto ceremony, with that person also having to be the initial target and to have not played in the veto. With again, that portion of the fan base getting really upset if you use this term incorrectly, which to me is dumb, as I mean, obviously just none of it matters, especially in the modern day landscape, where again, like, the aspect of not playing in the veto in the modern day is just very arbitrary, as obviously the people that are picked by random draw anyway. So again, I personally think it's really dumb to consider that part of the criteria. While otherwise, even over the course of its initial season, the term is used for vastly different reasons, where obviously Marvin initially used it as another name for the six-finger plan, though again, Karen claims during her boot episode that she was backdoored, despite obviously having played in the veto, and despite the fact that she wasn't the HOH's target. While we then see Diane later define the backdoor, being the only person to actually define the term on the show, as she ends up describing it as essentially just a blindside, which I think is probably the way that it's currently used in the modern day. However, again, to me, it's like, I really don't care how people use this term. It's always been pretty arbitrary. The show has no consistency in using the term, even in its original season. Now again, I personally have my own definition of what I consider a backdoor, where I do look at it as someone that is nominated as the target after the veto ceremony. And again, I guess you can add in this stipulation that they were the target before nominations, though again, like, I really don't care what other people use as the definition of backdoor. Like, to me, it doesn't matter. So I do get pretty annoyed at people that get on this like high horse over like, how dare you use the term backdoor? They played in the veto. It's like, it doesn't matter. Where again, many of the stipulations over the initial plan just simply don't hold any weight anymore. Where again, even if the initial cast that utilized the term can get sorted out, I don't think it really matters how the term is actually utilized. But for the eviction, we do get a couple notable segments here. We finally get a segment about Karen really hyping up her game on her way out, showing her explaining her social game and her jury management, really the major pros of Karen's game, where we see Karen had been pretty pleasant to people on their way out, even holding Marvin's hand, walking him to the door despite hating him. To which she also talks about how, despite the fact that she's 30, she's able to blend in with people younger than her and actively does things to be part of the group. And she cries with people when they're sad. And again, all this is a really interesting segment on the show that kind of explains what it means to be playing a social game. Something, again, I think is very difficult to articulate in these social strategy games. So again, it was cool to see a segment here. And again, especially as it really just hypes up Karen as a player, who I do think is an understated player in Big Brother history. Though also it is kind of funny how this segment is followed up by Drew literally saying that he doesn't want Karen to win due to her kissing ass. Well, obviously, this is the point where Drew starts playing the middle of the Cowboy and Diane dynamic, to where at this point they end up creating a final 3, to where both of them are taking Drew to the final 2, where he ends up telling both of them that he's taking them to the final 2 as well, essentially putting them in a perfect position moving forward. Though I think what's interesting here is, what is Drew actually thinking at this point? And I think I came into this rewatch just assuming that he was always going to be loyal to Cowboy. However, I think it's pretty clear that he is worried about Cowboy and Cowboy's winning chances, where he does talk about how Cowboy is going to win if he gets to the final 2, as how could you not love Cowboy, which I mean, like, half the jury doesn't, but either way. But again, I do think it's kind of interesting that I do fully think that he was probably going to take Diane until pretty late into this game, which I guess kind of rationalizes Diane's moves, though again, I just feel like she could have done a lot more to better her own personal position over putting all her eggs in Drew's basket. Now, we do also get a pretty funny jury segment where obviously Marvin arrives at the jury, to where I just love this little moment of him explaining to the others what happened in the game while he's dancing on a table and proceeds to lay down on it, which is this really funny visual. But anyway, it leads up to the vote where Karen ends up being blindsided with her saying, "Thank you for backdooring me," and that not even Marvin was backdoored, to which Diane ends up saying as she leaves that it wasn't a backdoor, only for Karen to clarify, yes, it was. Which, just in general, is not great jury management for Diane here either, where, again, Karen leaves here clearly being upset at Diane, to the point where I do feel like it's very unlikely that Karen ends up voting for Diane unless she's at the end against Cowboy, which I do think is pretty detrimental for Diane's winning chances. But anyway, we lose Karen this week, which, again, I think Karen is a pretty underrated character and also an underrated player on this season. Again, I think she had some pretty funny moments that don't really get talked about as much. Again, her impersonations in DR were interesting. She had these like funny segments about people thinking that she's crazy and her constantly talking about Larry. And again, I do think she is fun in that light, but also I think, again, she's a pretty competent player. Again, I think socially she is probably one of the best players we had seen up to this point in Big Brother history. Well, also at this point, I think probably being one of the more informed on jury management in Big Brother history as well, where, again, the fact that she's able to articulate these on this show is pretty impressive considering how difficult concepts they are to explain on the show. And mixing that with the fact that, again, like, she does have a lot of pull over how this season plays out. Again, she is a pretty integral number within the Pinky Swear Alliance, where her and Will were major cogs in getting that group together. and did a lot of campaigning to get their way, most of the time being pretty successful. And having the numbers to keep Lori until obviously the veto is used, where at that point obviously it's mute. You have her keeping the ship steady during the Scott and Jace boots. You have her and having these really incredible relationships with the jury, to where most of the jury does come out of the game being pretty pro Karen. Now again, I still stand by the fact that I do think a lot of her tactics aren't really that effective in the modern day. So I do think her style of jury management is simply one that would not be that well respected from a modern day lens, where I think a lot of people would look at it as her being an overly emotional player and one that wasn't playing the game that strategically. So again, I do think the vibe that she gives off is simply not that. I think she would definitely have to adapt her strategy in the modern day. But again, at the end of the day, I do think she's a pretty big player on this season, and one that kind of had an understanding of the game that I think you rarely see in early Big Brother. But with that, we now move on to the final 4 round, where we start all off with another Q&A HOH of before or after, to where Drew ends up getting every question right here and winning the HOH, securing his spot in the final 3, and essentially being a Nokomis eviction away from just winning the game outright. But here we obviously see the reaction to the Karen boot, where again, I don't feel like Diane comes off particularly well here, and again, claiming that we didn't backdoor her, we just didn't tell her the whole truth, and that she claims Nokomis that she didn't lie. Though interestingly, this is followed by Diane literally saying that she doesn't care about the jury, as she doesn't think the jury will give her the money, something that she later claims the complete opposite, which actually causes the end of her game, ironically. But yeah, I think this is something that, again, if she was saying this as gameplay, I do think it could be good, in the sense that obviously you are making people think that you're very unlikely to win a jury vote, and make it unlikely that you're going to try to win a jury vote. But again, I don't know how intentional that is, considering it does seem like she goes against this notion later on in the season. Anyway, here we do see Cowboy being frustrated that Drew had won the HOH, where we actually see the fact that Drew and Diane had actually both planned to throw the comp to Cowboy, which, I mean, to be fair, is a pretty dumb plan for them to even agree to begin with. Dumb for Drew, as he would have then been a very likely boot had Nokomis won the veto, but also dumb for Diane, as at this point she should be wanting Cowboy out to guarantee her a spot in the final 2 by taking out Cowboy, forcing Drew's hand to take her, while also having Nokomis take her to the end, which just leads me to be very confused over what exactly Diane was doing across this week, to where she does seem to fully still believe that Drew is taking her to the end, though again does seem content with the possibility of getting to 3 with Cowboy, which I guess if you're under the assumption that he's not going to win parts 1 and 2 of the final HOH, it could be an okay strategy. I mean, we've literally seen this being done many times in the past, but I feel like for Diane particularly, it just puts her in a very precarious position, especially considering the fact that Drew and Cowboy are very close in their own right. But even beyond that, I mean, we end up seeing her volunteer to go on the block and volunteer to also win the veto just to not use it, which, I mean, to be fair, she also claimed at the final 6 and didn't go through with it there, so maybe she wouldn't have gone through with it here. But again, all this is like, why? Like, it feels like she's doing all this just to simply still be able to keep her word to Drew and Cowboy, but also keep her word to Nokomis by never voting her out. Now, again, to be fair to Diane, I believe if she had somehow been forced to make the vote to evict here, she would have voted to vote out Cowboy over Nokomis, which would have been her optimal move. But again, seemingly not because of game reasons, but more so because she had this bigger promise with Nokomis that she didn't want to break. And again, instead here, she ends up essentially almost making sure that situation doesn't happen, and instead just entirely relies on Cowboy, this very honor-bound player, but also one that is a self-proclaimed family man. And you want this guy to be the one that votes out his own sister? Like, that does seem insane. But anyway, we get to the final veto, where it is a pretty easy mental/physical comp of having to run around and connect these pictures of the veto winners together, which it should have been simple, but we do see Drew just completely bombing this, ironically forgetting that he himself had won a veto, while we also see Diane end up wanting to throw it, though does claim that she did try just to make sure that Nokomis didn't win, I guess. But Cowboy ends up actually having a mostly perfect run here and ends up winning the veto, his only true win of the season, essentially meaning that all of Diane's plotting wouldn't have mattered anyway. But still, here we do see Nokomis campaigning to Cowboy, though to no avail, as Cowboy isn't going to break his final 3 deal, even though he should. But strangely, I don't believe he ends up really confirming to anybody what exactly he's going to do, even to Drew, to where they were all a bit unsure coming into the eviction. Though, again, the deciding factor here does seem to stem back to Nokomis' willingness to vote him out the previous week, which does make him worry about her voting him out at 3, which is actually really dumb. As again, what do you think Diane is going to do? Like, I would much rather take the chance of my own sister taking me the final 2 than Diane, who is hooking up with the other person course, in the final 3, anyway, Nokomis now knowing that she's going home, we do end up seeing her essentially have a mental breakdown, one that we get glimpses of on the show, with her being upset at not being in control anymore and yelling about how she doesn't know what's going on and she's going nuts. To which we see Diane laughing at this, seeming to think it's a strat from her and her trying to get Cowboy to feel bad for her and take her to the end because of that, which I don't know if I fully believe, as I do feel like if this was a strat, why wouldn't she just say that in a DR? And even beyond that, again, the part of the rant that didn't make the air was her essentially just ranting about production, calling them sadistic assholes, or how messed up it is that they put her in the house with Cowboy, and they end up fucking up their family's lives for a fucking ratings boost. So again, like, I do feel like this seemed pretty genuine to me, especially considering there's no real evidence of this not being genuine outside that. But anyway, through this, we also get our final batch of character moments for the season, as obviously the rest of the season beyond this is pretty much like nonstop action to conclude the game. Yeah, we get some dodo content for Cowboy with him doing some martial arts, and also the players being given these really expensive steaks that Cowboy ends up overcooking. We also get more of the Drew-Diane relationship, with it finally showing us this more genuine perspective from Drew, of him clarifying that she isn't my girlfriend after she asks him to be her boyfriend, essentially confirming power dynamic between the two. Well, also we get a segment about the women gaining weight, because I guess they thought that was appropriate to do. And we even get this confessional from Cowboy talking about how they should eat salad and use the gym, which again, all that is very strange. But we also end up getting a segment that is very similar to the one we got in BB4 of the players having to destroy each other's clothes. To which the way they end up doing this is based around things you do at a state fair, including deep frying their clothes, which was a very surreal thing to see. All the sense of leading to them getting a shopping spree, which was mostly boring TV. But either way, it all culminates in the veto ceremony, where Cowboy is told to use the veto to save either Drew or Nokomis, with the person he doesn't use the veto on being taken out by default, which is a weird way of handling this, where obviously in the modern day, they would simply just make it so Cowboy would not use the veto, and then he would simply be the vote to evict, which I'm too fair. I mean, there's not much of a difference in this, but I do find it kind of weird that that is the way they went around this, and this leads to Cowboy saying that he chooses to use the veto to save you, Diane, meaning that Cowboy has now evicted his own sister, which is kind of ironic, actually, considering the fact that we get a lot of talk on the show about how Nokomis is willing to vote out Cowboy, but not the other way around. So I think it was kind of funny for that to be the way this turns out. But again, we do get some interesting comments from Nokomis in her exit interview, to where she does say Diane plays the game like it's meant to be played, but would not like to be on another team with her, which is ironic considering they work together again on All Stars. Well, also she says that Drew is set and that he's going to be the winner, very much implying that she's going to vote for him, while also saying that she wouldn't vote for Cowboy. To which it's funny that Julie literally calls her out for being bitter, but again, none of this particularly ages well, considering she literally does vote for Cowboy over Drew, though again, we'll talk about that later. But again, with that, we do lose Nokomis, who I think is a player that I've probably a bit underestimated in Big Brother history. I mean, I think when I think of Nokomis, I do think about how overrated she is due to her getting the credit for the back door, which again, I still agree with that. I don't think she deserves much credit really at all for the execution of the back door. So again, for me, it's essentially just so happens that she was the HOH at the time that the back door was going to be executed. She didn't need to be the person that did it. She didn't create the idea for it. She simply was the person that was HOH that followed the other people's orders to make it go through. Now, beyond that, though, I think Nokomis is an interesting player. I mean, while I do think she is a very inconsistent player, she is someone that, again, did build very strong bonds with the likes of Diane, with the likes of Karen, with the likes of Will, even the twins early on in the season. Like, she had very strong allies in the game and was able to build up a lot of social capital from where she was at the beginning of the game, where, again, initially she was an outcast. No one really took her seriously. And again, she was nominated week 1, and for her to come out of that in a pretty strong power position throughout the middle portions of the game, I think is actually pretty impressive. Now, I will say I do think she's a bit rigid in the game and probably would be, again, inconsistent because of that. I do feel like she will probably find herself in some cast that she just simply just doesn't gel as well with, while also beyond that, I do feel like she probably doesn't have much of a killer instinct in the game, to where, again, I do feel like she kind of had Diane and Drew just playing circles around her for a lot of the end game stretch. And she was someone that was a bit naive to the overall strategic game that was happening around her. But again, I do feel like at the end of the day, Nokomis is probably a better player than I give her credit for. He's definitely a unique character at this point in Big Brother history, one that definitely stands out, to where, again, it made her a pretty easy shoe-in for the All-Star cast when that came around. But with that, we then move on to the final 3, where coming into this round, again, Drew's pretty much guaranteed final 2. But also, even beyond that, is pretty much guaranteed to win, with him probably beating both options here. But despite that, I do feel like this round plays out pretty much as well as it could have been, as it did seem like coming into this round, Drew did have deals with both Cowboy and Diane to throw the HOH to them, to allow them to be the one to cut the other one, though obviously instead this all culminates with him having to make that decision himself. Though it did seem like coming into this week, he was more loyal to Diane, where again, we get DRs indicating him being scared about going to the end with Cowboy and thinking that Cowboy would beat him, though obviously his mind ends up changing by the end of the week. But eventually we get to part 1 of the final HOH, which ends up being essentially the same Hands on Heart Idol ripoff that was utilized in the previous season, though this time the ground ends up shaking as well. So we get this humorous moment of Cowboy helping Diane pull up her hair, which ends up leading to him accidentally letting go, dropping out very early on, and obviously Cowboy saying that that's what I get for being a nice guy. That's Cowboy for you. But here we have Diane wanting Drew to throw the comp to her, and Drew seemingly being a bit apprehensive to that concept right now, talking about in the DR about how he does worry about Diane possibly having a guilty conscience over what happened to Cowboy and potentially taking him to the end because this, which is kind of dumb, but it is due to his indecision here that Diane ends up dropping before he comes to a conclusion, meaning Drew accidentally wins part 1 of the HOH here. So we then get kind of funny scenes here of Drew literally talking to both Cowboy and Diane and being annoyed at both of them for not winning part 1, with both of those plans completely failing. But anyway, this takes us to part 2, which obviously ends up being between Diane and Cowboy, which ends up being a pretty difficult trivia comp here, to where both of them end up struggling here, though Diane ends up having a pretty decent lead up until a question about whose face was morphed with the twins in Morphomatics, which I did feel like was a very unfair question here, one that Diane would have a disadvantage in, considering the fact that she actually didn't even play in this challenge. And while she was able to watch it, I do feel like needing to know who is combined with who in this competition definitely feels like something that disfavors Diane, and again, does feel very much like she would have easily beat Cowboy in part 2 had it not been for her getting stuck on that question. So I do feel like that's pretty bad luck there. But with that, we now have Drew versus Cowboy in part 3, with them hugging it out and claiming that it's been the two horsemen the entire time, which I do think Cowboy winning part 2 here does definitely play into Drew's change of mind later on, as this obviously has Drew now having to spend more time pacifying Cowboy, more so than Diane, and also has him having to prepare himself for a possible final 2 with Cowboy, as that's obviously the most likely outcome at this point, which I do think plays a factor into his state of mind as well. Though, truth be told, I do think a lot of the main reason why he does end up voting out Diane is more so due to the poor gameplay of Diane across this week. Again, I do think fully that he does come into this round with the intention of taking Diane to the end, but through this week, obviously Diane continues to talk about her hatred of Cowboy and how he doesn't deserve the money, and the fact that she would vote for Drew over Cowboy, which again just makes it pretty clear to Drew that he can cut her and she'll still end up voting for him. But even beyond that, we also get a moment that didn't make the show, but is commonly cited as the moment that Diane lost the game, which occurred the night before the eviction, where Diane got really drunk and ends up telling Drew that she thinks she has the jury votes to beat him. Which, the thing is, like, I don't even think that's true. As again, I think Drew is always going to get the twins plus Cowboy, and I think it's very likely he gets Karen as well. So again, I do personally believe that Drew does beat both Cowboy and Diane at the end, though again, both by pretty narrow margins. But again, it is Diane's overconfidence in her jury votes at this point, again, being the complete opposite of what she had been talking about in the previous round, I do think ends up really shifting Drew's mind here. So again, coming into the final comp, it does feel like at that point he was pretty secure in taking Cowboy to the end. So once again, Drew and Cowboy did create a plan to have Drew throw the final HOH to Cowboy, so that Cowboy can be the one to vote out Diane, which I don't get why Cowboy is agreeing to this. This is actually bad for Cowboy, as really I feel like the real life scenario plays out better for Cowboy, and the fact that at least can potentially actually cause Diane to become bitter, even though it doesn't. But despite this plan, Drew ends up winning Final HOH anyway, kind of showing how much Cowboy sucks. But through that, Drew obviously now has to make a very difficult decision, choosing between his girlfriend and his best friend, where he ends up saying that last night scared him, and he proceeds to vote out Diane, with Diane sobbing on her way out, which is probably one of the most emotional evictions in Big Brother history up to this point. I mean, being this pretty brutal move here of Drew cutting his showmance at the final three, obviously a move that we've seen like similar-ish moves down the road, but I do feel like up to this point, I mean, this is definitely the most brutal vote off this late in the game. This really massive betrayal here. And one that I think you can question if it was even the optimal move for Drew. As again, I do personally believe that he beats both Diane and Cowboy. And I think him voting out Diane here just adds to the potential of Diane being bitter at him. But really beyond that, again, I don't think he particularly handles his goodbye message well, where Diane is upset at how brief it is, though to be fair, it was probably recorded before Drew changed his mind, to where he probably didn't think it was going to matter. But again, now we do have Diane talking about how the jury vote is the toughest decision that she's going to have to make, though obviously she still votes for Drew anyway. But still, with that, let's talk about Diane, who obviously is a major player on this season, probably the biggest player of this season. I mean, she is kind of all over the place on this season. She is kind of this main source of conflict between the Women's Alliance and the Horsemen early on this season, getting the fights with both Scott and Jace. She also ends up betraying Holly early on, despite Holly thinking of her as a very close ally. We have her being the HOH to take Scott out of the game, and then obviously being a major factor into taking Jace out of the game. And then beyond that, she really plays the middle pretty expertly, and getting the twins to make this move that further increases the target on their back, along with following that, really ends up securing Drew's position in the game, getting to the end game with Drew. Again, making that big move at Final 5, and again, while I question if it was the right move, it's still, like, again, a very impressive stretch of gameplay of her making some pretty big strategic moves, especially for this point in Big Brother history. Now, I will say, again, I do question the quality of some of these moves. I do also question her win equity, to where I do think she is someone that probably does struggle with winning a jury vote in many situations. She burned a lot of this jury on their ways out, and I do think jury management in particular is a major weakness of Diane's, to where, again, both twins came out of the house hating her. Marvin was upset at her, and while I do think Marvin would have been open to voting for her still, and did not handle that situation well. Also did not handle Karen well on her way out. So we're also having a pretty hostile relationship with Cowboy. Like, I really feel like Diane struggles in a lot of jury scenarios, where the only person I could see her actually for sure beating is Cowboy. But even then, that's in a 4-3 vote. And also, that's not even locked in, considering the swing there is Drew. For again, it's not on the run possibility that Drew himself will vote for her. Again, I think that's a major hole in Diane's game. But again, her strategic maneuvering is very impressive. And again, as a character, she's also really fun. Again, she gets into a lot of confrontations. She has really fun DRs, probably being one of the best confessionalists of the season. But really, I just feel like she was one of the stars of this season, and also one of the bigger power players of this season, where it obviously makes a lot of sense why she was later brought back for All Stars. But now let's get to the finale, which ends up being a very different finale from the ones we've seen in previous seasons, where in previous finales from seasons 2 to 4, we see them play out very similarly, where there was not a live audience involved, and instead it was one that had a pre-taped reunion, along with the jury votes being cast before the day of the finale, with the season culminating with the jurors re-entering the house and revealing their votes themselves. A format that I personally liked, though I understand why they got rid of it, with it leading to some really awkward moments, particularly in BB4. Obviously, the last time we see it, where the other players were just obviously extremely bitter at the players themselves, which led to this really awkward tone throughout a lot of it. Sort of format they end up coming with here ends up essentially being the prototype for the modern finale format, of us getting a live finale with a massive crowd there. We also get a jury roundtable, followed by the jury casting their votes live, and then we get the reunion immediately following that, this time with the pre-jurors having watched the show while the jurors have not, which is also another thing I kind of miss. I do wish that we could get a reunion after everyone had watched the show to get their reactions to that, but obviously all culminates in the winner reveal being led by Julie herself instead of the other players, which obviously feels more right, as that's the point of having a host. And again, this format's obviously fine, though again, I think I personally prefer the original format, despite it leading to a lot of awkward moments within it. But anyway, the episode does start with a pretty funny little moment of them starting and stopping the season recap 3 times before letting it go through. It really feeling like the people in the control room just did not know the exact timing of when to start it. But anyway, we eventually get the jury roundtable where Diane obviously comes in and says, I know you were hoping for Cowboy, which, I mean, were they? Or again, it kind of felt like Diane kind of overestimated how much the jury loved her in this instance. But anyway, the twins do end up spending a lot of time here defending Drew, with Marvin being upset at them for doing so, which is funny considering the twins literally vote for Cowboy while Marvin votes for Drew. Also, we see Diane here clearly campaigning for Drew, calling Cowboy a puppet that sat in Drew's behind. While we see Marvin asking Nokomis if she thinks Cowboy is a sorry, spineless loser or not, with Nokomis now campaigning for Cowboy, seemingly just because he's her brother, where again, this is a pretty big change of mind from how she talked about him when she left the show. But anyway, we then follow this up with the jury questioning, where I didn't feel like either of them performed particularly well. Now, Drew for the most part was just kind of fine, but Cowboy does end up having some pretty bad answers throughout it. Though, to be fair, I did feel like a majority of the jury here were pretty much out on Cowboy from the beginning, where we do see the likes of Diane, Karen, and Marvin constantly mocking his answers. But we do get a funny response from him from Natalie's question, who asks, what are 3 moves you made strategically? And his response is being part of the 4 horsemen, which I guess, winning the veto, which again is not strategy, and also being himself, which is also not really a strategy. But also here, probably the most notable question of the bunch ends up coming from Marvin, where he calls out Drew for using and abusing Diane, calls him out for calling her a trailer chick, to where the more notable aspect of all this is what he says to Cowboy, to where she asks him, are you a racist liar or a lying racist? Which obviously takes Cowboy aback, which again, I've said this before in the review, I do think, yeah, there could be biases playing a factor into why Cowboy doesn't like Marvin, but I don't think there's any real proof to Michael being like overtly racist at any point, where it does very much feel like the targeting of Marvin is more so stemming back to Marvin's proclamations about how rich Michael's family is. Though, to be fair, Michael himself does not respond well to this question, but he essentially says that he can't be racist because he has 2 black nephews and that he loves every type of race, Chinese or Japanese, which again is not helping his cause there. But either way, the jury ends up casting their votes, with Nokomis saying that only one thing contributed to her vote, which I wonder who she voted for. And we do end up seeing Will voting last, where I will say I don't particularly like that the vote order here seemed to be purely random, where again, I like it better when they're ordered based on their placement. But either way, he ends up saying explicitly that I could be the tiebreaker, which I wonder if that'll be relevant. But anyway, we then get to the reunion segment where we do find out that Jason and Holly are still together somehow, along with the fact that Jason and Scott now don't get along, with there being a lot of awkwardness between the two, which seems to stem from the entire handling of the Holly situation, and really just their drama ends up really overshadowing this entire segment here, with Jace really hogging up a lot of the airtime, as he typically does. But we also get some awkwardness from him being annoyed at Will as well, and constantly making jabs at him, though we do also get another little funnier moment from Mike saying the thing that surprised him the most was just how much Karen was backstabbing everybody, and Karen getting upset at this statement, saying that she was playing loyal to a fault, which, to be fair, I do feel like Mike's comments are probably a bit hyperbolic, but still funny to see Karen get called out for her gameplay, especially considering the fact that she does come off on a high horse at points. But anyway, we get to the vote reveal, where it obviously ends up being a 4-3 vote, with Will being the deciding vote, with him voting for Drew. Being a weird case of Drew winning most endgame situations on this season, even though most of those situations would end up being pretty close vote, where here obviously he gets the votes of Diane and Marvin, as he always was going to against Cowboy, while also picking up Karen and Will, who again also never really respected Cowboy. While Cowboy only gets the votes of Nokomis, his sister, alongside the twins, who are obviously always going to vote together, with them seeming to vote for Cowboy simply because they kind of felt bad for him, over them actually like respecting him that much more. And straight up, again, I do think the twins vote for Drew in pretty much every other Final 2 situation. Now, straight up, I do think while Drew is a pretty boring character TV-wise, I do think his win here is probably one of the more satisfying outcomes. Again, it being a pretty solid one gameplay-wise, while also him having obviously had to cut Diane by the end game, which, considering a lot of the endgame storyline revolved around Diane and Drew, I do think for him to end up cutting her at the end and end up winning following that ends up being a pretty satisfying way for the season to go out. But with that, that is the entire season. So let's wrap up this video by talking about the final 2, starting it off with Cowboy, who, again, as I mentioned before, I mean, like, the only votes he gets are from the twins and his sister. And really, I think those are most of your votes he's going to get in most situations. I think Ozzy has a chance of getting Drew's, but Cowboy is like kind of just this weird player to where, despite the fact that he gets so many jury votes at the end, I do think he very much struggles with winning a jury vote. Where I think his best chance would have been against Diane, to where, to be fair, he definitely could win that. However, I do think Nokomis and Drew are both pretty big swings there, to where while Nokomis was annoyed with Diane, she also was much closer to Diane on the season, especially in comparison to the likes of Drew, to where I could definitely see a world where she still goes Diane over Cowboy. And again, I could see Drew going either way as well. But really, I feel like it's kind of a moot point anyway, considering even if Cowboy does win, it's still not that impressive of a win. I mean, he's simply a player that doesn't really seem to do that much actively. He's just someone that is kind of a likable dodo figure on the show. But the problem is that a lot of that also translates to his game. Again, he is kind of a aloof player in the game, one that is, again, following alongside Drew. And again, while there are like little moments of him having good ideas, I do feel like the majority of his game is simply just being there. Like, he doesn't really do that much actively outside of, again, building good relationships with the Horsemen and eventually good relations with the Twins, but he doesn't really expand beyond that. Again, he had a very hostile relationship with Diane. His own sister didn't particularly like him. Obviously, he had a hostile relationship with Marvin. Never was particularly close to either Will or Karen. I think that is probably where, again, he's kind of just lacking socially in that sense, to where I think while he's very close to people he is close to, there's also a good batch of people that he has no real connection to. And mixing that with the fact that he has very little strategic chops in the game, them not really doing much actively in the game, I do think it really sets him back, to where I don't personally look at him as that great of a player despite coming relatively close to winning the game. Now again, he's not a absolutely terrible player either. Again, he still gets to the final two with some potential win equity, I guess, but just not a player that really has any true killer instinct in the game, and is a player that doesn't really do particularly well in any of the tenets of the game. But with that, let's now move on to Drew, where I think Drew is a player that I feel like I understand a lot more after a rewatch. And while there's definitely still some points here and there where I don't fully understand his rationale, even after looking at live feed updates from the time, again, I'm a bit hazy on what exactly he was feeling about Diane mid-game. I also feel like his gameplay during his first HOH was very questionable, but I do think there's a lot to like in Drew's game, particularly his positioning, and I think his social game as well. Again, he was well liked socially, now not to like a ridiculous degree, but again, at least to the point where, again, he was kept relatively safe. Obviously, he had these really strong bonds with Cowboy and Diane, and was able to get them both to the final three together, was able to get Diane to keep him safe for a good chunk of the game, also doing very good work with the Twins, and again, the formation of the Twin Alliance was very impressive, and it completely fracturing the Pinky Swear Alliance, and him getting the Twins and Diane to be more loyal to him than they were to their initial group. And again, all that is pretty good, and obviously mixing out the fact that at this point in Big Brother history, he does break the record for most HOH wins with 4, and I think he very much excels in the physical and social aspects of the game. I think my big qualm with Drew is probably strategic game. I do think his strategic game is pretty lacking. Again, his first HOH is kind of just all over the place. While there's good ideas there for sure in terms of him trying to play the middle, I do think the way he goes about it is all wrong. I also feel like while he does make some pretty impressive moves on the season, I feel like very few of them are based around pure strategy in the game. Again, he does do good work in making the Twins bigger targets ahead of him, but again, I do feel like a lot of that kind of fell into his lap. And the Twins wanting to cause a tie to get rid of Will to begin with, which again, I don't feel like he did much to really egg that on. He just took advantage of a very good position he was put in. Same thing in the Final 5 situation. Where's Diane that had to tell him about that plan to take out Karen, which obviously greatly benefits him. We also have his cutting of Diane, which again, I still question if it was necessary. And again, I think the way he does it is also still not optimal. So again, I think there definitely are some bad things, but in a way also his cutting of Diane does show his killer instinct. It does show that if he feels like he needs to, he is willing to make a move to win him the game. And again, I do feel like that probably does boost him a little bit in terms of my overall perception of his game, even though it probably wasn't the optimal move. So I do feel like Drew is probably one of the best competitors we've seen up to this point. And what's funny too is that it's not even due to like physical strength, despite him being this like young all-American jock that would typically do well in a majority of competitions. Almost every competition he wins on this season is a quiz, to where the only comps that he wins that aren't quiz comps are part 1 of the final HOH and the veto that he was essentially handed. While again, also his social connections and the way he was able to utilize them to navigate through the game was also very, very impressive. Now, in a way, again, you could say he was fortunate in the fact that Diane had a lot of influence in the game, and obviously the fact that he had this connection to Diane obviously greatly benefited him in the game. But I still think he does a lot of good work in positioning himself again with the horseman initially and making him the most open to working with the opposing side during those early days, while also working alongside Adria and Natalie, and still somehow not being targeted the final 5 round, which is still insanity to me. And considering also again the fact that I think Drew beats almost everybody in the jury vote, I think is also another thing to really prop him up. I think the only person he probably loses against is Karen, and even that's not even a full guarantee. Like, I just think Drew is a very impressive player on this season, especially from a positioning and win equity perspective. So we're mixing those things, the fact that he does demonstrate this ability to cut Diane at the end. I do think it makes Drew a pretty deadly player, one that I do think is probably a bit underestimated in Big Brother history. But there we go. I mean, that is the entire season of BB5, which is a season that I personally have a lot of nostalgia for, where again, it's a season I watched when I was a kid, but even beyond that, it does very much feel like the end of an era, the last season that's portrayed in this old school sort of way, with this more dramatic music, the more mature tone, and it being the last season in the OG Big Brother house. Though, again, I still do understand why it's one of the more forgotten seasons in the show's history, feeling like a season that lacks a wide range of big, iconic moments, especially outside of the Project DNA related twists and the formation of the back door, which even in itself, I feel like people don't really talk about that much. But again, I really do love many of these season's characters. I mean, you have Jason Scott, who are really insane pre-merge boots, alongside even Holly, who's another really insane character. You have Marvin, who, despite being, again, a questionable person, definitely felt like a very unique character to bring to the show. You had Nokomis and Cowboy, both also being unique characters at this point. You had the likes of Karen and Will, and even Diane, who had great confessionals, with obviously Diane's run on the season being one of the most notable aspects of the season, both gameplay-wise and narratively. Also, you have Drew, who, while boring, is a very interesting player, and one that navigates the game in a pretty interesting way here, to where, again, overall, I just find this season to be a pretty fun ride. Though, again, I can see how my connection to the season definitely boons that, so I can understand why this season doesn't necessarily click with some others, but still a season that I personally do really enjoy. Well, with that, I mean, those are my thoughts on Big Brother 5, 20 years after its initial airing. Now, moving forward, like my other retrospectives, I will be doing a player ranking for this season at some point down the road. Also, you can expect a BB6 retrospective in this vein at some point next year, and just in general, expect the similar content you can expect from the channel moving forward. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.